Chapter 8:11. Under the watchful eyes of the crowd, a blond man with exaggerated earrings walked over and stood in front of her chair. He performed a mechanical dance skillfully and neatly, causing many people to whistle. Some people even picked up their phones and started filming. After finishing the dance, he smoothed his hair and smiled at the girl in the gray dress. "Hello, are you playing the piano, miss? We can play together." Yuan lowered her head and glanced at his seemingly friendly smile, as well as the small needle holes under his cuffs and wrists. She looked away. "Sorry, I'm waiting for someone. I don't have time." "I can wait with you." The man stuck to her like a sticky candy. He leaned closer and told her enthusiastically, "You can wait for as long as you want. It won't take long." Yuan said softly, "They'll be here soon." Behind her, there was the screeching sound of tires rubbing against the ground. A huge truck braked on the street. Behind the logo of Hawaii Commercial, the door opened and a few worker-like men jumped out. They held roadblocks and blocked the intersection. At the other end of the street, another car also stopped in front of the traffic hub, completely sealing off the most prosperous road. In fact, it was just for show. They set up 2 roadblocks and stopped a car. Then, they threw down their things and left. There was a large gap for people to enter and exit. They left a shortcut for people to escape, like a dog hole. The uneasy atmosphere spread silently, causing the blond man's expression to stiffen. Then, he heard a voice beside him. Excuse me. Yuan glanced at him. "My performance is about to begin." The Guqin case opened on its own at her feet, and the Mountain Lord Greatsword let out a sonorous cry. The sharp and fragmented sound was so ear-piercing that it carried the penetrative power of a Guqin. In an instant, it spread out in all directions. It was like a cold wind, causing everyone's skin to tighten, involuntarily tremble, and have goosebumps. The bone-piercing evil aura gave rise to an illusionary sound of tides, almost swallowing everyone. The blond man's legs went soft, and he subconsciously staggered back. He finally realized the ruthless nature hidden under that beautiful appearance. That wasn't the plaything he had imagined, but something beyond his imagination, a predator. Now, right beside Yuan, the heavy giant sword revealed a ferocious cold light. The Mountain Lord roared, announcing his existence. There was no need for the 3 of them to say anything. There were fierce tigers walking on the streets of the city, mercilessly provoking their opponents in the hunting ground. "Tell them, I'm here." On this wide street, a show without any gentleness or elegance was about to begin. TSK. The smoking man was stunned for a moment. Then he became regretful and unhappy. The guard next to him immediately gloated. "I told you, you should take care of it." "I can't do anything about it." The man who was smoking put out his cigarette. "I don't want it either. I just feel that it's a pity." "Pity what?" "I can't find a more suitable girl to be a model." The man was helpless. He could already foresee the future. "I hope it won't be too big. Otherwise, it will be very troublesome to clean the road." At that moment, the disturbed beasts raised their eyes. Amidst the warm music of the shopping mall, the passionate rhythm of the nightclub, and the hoarse singing of the nightclub, the warriors who were decorated by alcohol, beauty, and even luxury raised their eyes at the same time. They felt the provocation from afar. Their thumbs subconsciously pushed out the hilt of the sword at their waist. They had a premonition that a fight was coming. Behind the gate, under the overpass, and in the windows, those cold eyes looked at them. Compared to them, the managers here reacted faster. The man who was no longer smoking looked on from afar, but the old man in the robe couldn't sit still. He leaned on his walking stick and asked, "Little girl, I don't know who you are looking for, but isn't it a bit too overbearing to suddenly block the road? Block the road? Yuan was puzzled. She pointed behind her. No. Look, isn't the sidewalk quite spacious? It was as if she didn't know anything. After the provocation, she was considerate enough to leave a dog hole for her opponents to escape. But any warrior who still had the strength to hold a sword would not choose to do so. From this moment on, it was destined that if they wanted to walk out of here openly, the only way was to fight with weapons. Reckless. The old man withdrew his gaze in disappointment. He lowered his head and looked at the blond man next to him. Ludote, you know her? No, I don't know her. It has nothing to do with me. Ludo shook his head frantically, his face pale. Then why are you lying down? Are you staying to let others test your sword? The old man angrily scolded. If it weren't for the fact that he was an acquaintance and a subordinate, he would have left him alone. Get out. The man on the ground staggered up and wanted to escape. But soon he was frozen in place and did not dare to move again. He felt a piercing chill. It came from the cold-looking young man in front of him. Shun by Lu, Mi Fang Yashing, the young warrior lifted the hood of his sweater, revealing the solid hilt of his sword in the cloth bag behind him. He looked up and stared at the provocateur. Do you know what you are doing, crazy man? He said, I don't have the saying that I don't kill women. Then wouldn't it be even more embarrassing if you were killed by a woman? Yuan asked, holding the Shanjun in his hand. Let's not waste time on pleasantries. Aren't the people in the line still waiting? Behind me, Fang Yashing. In the crowd, dozens of ferocious, murderous intents rose. The warriors looked up with their scarlet eyes. They could not wait any longer. At that moment, thunder burst forth. A hurricane spread in the air with a roar. Without waiting for Yuan to get up from the chair, a cold iron light rose from the torn cloth bag and swept forward with Mi Fang Yashing's sprint. What jumped out of the cloth bag that was too big to hold was actually an exaggerated odachi. It was surrounded by the fluorescence of flowing water, echoing the sound of thunder, and there were wisps of electric light appearing. His cold and gloomy face was like that of a ghost. In an instant, it was close at hand, shrinking ground. But then, the slashing stopped abruptly. It was in a stalemate. Only the high-pitched sound of metal colliding spread. In an instant, everyone's vision blurred. They only saw two sparks bursting out in the air. The sharp sound pierced everyone's eardrums. Then, the two sides passed each other. Mi Fang Yashing's movements were stiff. Only now did everyone see clearly that he was holding two weapons. In addition to the kodachi, there was a rib chakra hidden at the back of his sweater. The so-called divine avoidance sect was originally a two-blade sect, but now there was a gap on the kodachi. The rib chakra had been cut in half and fell to the ground with a clang. Along with it, half of the rope on the sweater's hood fell to the ground. A tear silently appeared on his sweater, right in front of his throat. The remaining coldness seeped into his bone marrow, bringing about a tangible pain in his throat. Mi Fang Yashing's eyes widened in disbelief. If the woman on the chair had moved just a millimeter, his head would have been separated from his body. Just a little bit, but from the beginning to the end, she did not get up from her chair. Leave the sword and you can go. Yuan turned around and said goodbye. Then she looked forward. Next, such a disrespectful attitude caused the samurai's anger to spread like a tsunami. In an instant, countless swords were unsheathed. If they originally had the attitude of watching a play, they couldn't help but become serious in the face of such a tragic disaster. On the high chair, Yuan still pressed Yamagata on her knees and stared at her opponents, waiting. The next person came forward. In the truck behind her, Forrest Hutt was lying on the driver's seat with a pair of sunglasses on his face. He crossed his legs and whistled. There are already 2 books at the start. Today is really a good day. Bang! A high-pitched voice rang out, and his whistle paused for a moment. Now, there were 3 books. In front of Yuan Yuan, the man who had drawn the sword was livid. He held the sword in his hand tightly, but under Yamagata's suppression, the sword was still pressing down inch by inch. The sword was close to him. He could not hold it up, and he could not breathe. Yuan Yuan's hand holding the sword shook slightly. With a twist of her wrist, the fine vibration spread in an instant and passed on to the sword, bursting out with a thunderous roar like a fierce tiger. She was rubbing the strings. Along with the contact between the blade and the blade, the sudden tremor spread out, instantly penetrating the opponent's body with the force of the drumstick, causing the opponent's vision to turn black. When he came to his senses, he was already flying in the air and falling backward. He hit the ground. The long sword fell out of his hand. Next, Yuan Yuan said coldly, like a ticket seller sitting behind the window, reminding her opponents to line up in an orderly manner. It was a civilized duel, but it didn't matter if it was not orderly. It didn't matter if it was a little barbaric. In this way, she defeated the first, second, and third opponents with irresistible force. After careful consideration, she defeated the fourth, fifth, and sixth opponents. It was not until the seventh and eighth opponents began to besiege her that she finally got up from the bench. But the moment she stood on the ground, she was waiting for the ninth opponent to appear, waiting for the ninth opponent to stand in front of her. In the midst of the mess, there was only one high chair that stood alone under the traffic light. The warm-up exercise was finally over, but for some reason, she found it difficult to concentrate in front of the duel. Facing enemies more than 10 times her size, she was a little distracted. Inexplicably, she recalled the scene not long ago. "Little brat, this is your illness," once the monster-like old man said to her. "If you don't solve it, I'm afraid you won't be able to achieve real success in your life, right?" When he said this, his smile was regretful and mocking, as if he was overlooking a tragedy that had nothing to do with him and indifferently made an irresponsible judgment. There was no warmth in his eyes. He just gloated and enjoyed her embarrassing appearance. He cruelly defeated her until she did not even have the strength to hold the sword. That's all for today. The old man carried the mace and waved his hand coldly. "It's time to rest. Please wait a minute." In the dizziness, she subconsciously propped herself up and looked at the back of the old man. "What did you mean just now?" Chapter 8:12. It's literally what it means. Elder Luo looked back and asked in confusion, "You don't understand?" After a short silence, Yuan Yuan replied, "I don't think there's anything wrong with that. It doesn't matter. Who doesn't have a little problem in this world, right?" Elder Luo said indifferently, "At most, you just don't have a good life." When she picked up the sword, she didn't feel happy. When she put down the sword, she didn't feel peace either. Whenever she was alone, she would feel an indescribable sense of loss and fear. Like a lost person, she would wander back and forth, unable to decide what to do. "Let me guess." Elder Luo pinched his chin and thought. His smile became more and more evil. "Don't tell me that even you think of yourself as a good child." Yuan Yuan didn't say anything. "You're a member of the Gen family, right?" Elder Luo asked. "I've seen your uncle before." Why don't you look like him at all? Women and men are always different. Really? Elder Luo was puzzled. But why do I always hear that the women of the Jen family are crazier than the men? This was the blood of the Jen family's struggle, the bloodline that had been passed on from the wars, slaughters, and the cruel selection of the survival of the fittest a few years ago was almost the most perfect machine of violence, even from elementary school. Kindergarten, from the day they were weaned, they would begin to experience uncontrollable violent impulses. This was a struggle engraved in their nature. The Jen family's countermeasure wasn't to suppress it. Instead, they tried to use this power for the right path. If the struggle was despicable, then they would seek a more noble way of fighting, a way that could satisfy both sides. But no matter how dazzling and glorious it was, it couldn't erase the cruel nature of it. Men were like that. Women should be like that. Father was like this. Uncle was like this. Uncle was like this. Aunt was like this, including Yuan Zhao. Everyone was like this. Only Yuan was different. Since she was young, she was unbelievably quiet. She was calm and mature, just like other children. Natural and unrestrained, upright and dignified. She never caused trouble for the family and was unbelievably well-behaved. But this isn't right, right? Elder Luo said, mockingly. You're just restraining yourself. It's not bad to restrain yourself, but you know in your heart that you didn't succeed. You're just too obsessed with the image of a good child and confused it with yourself. You are different from your teacher. Your teacher only used violence as a means to achieve his goal. He took it for granted that others had the same unreasonable self-control as him. Therefore, he did not notice your pain. But you should know that you are different from him. The old man saw through the girl's weakest point and told her coldly, "You don't have such a strong pillar of support and strength in your heart, and you can't suppress this violent nature that is too large compared to your rationality. You can't become him. You haven't even been yourself." In silence, Yuan clenched her weapon but was unable to refute. Only the raging sound of swords could be heard. "Little girl, one day you will understand the meaning of this sword that your family gave you." Before he left, the old man took one last look at the sword in her hand, the blade of vicious beasts that was crowned with the title of Mountain Lord. No matter how ferocious a beast was, once it was locked in a cage, it was nothing more than an ornament to be enjoyed. In any case, we have to release the tiger back into the mountain, free it, and free you at that moment. Yuan couldn't help but raise her head and stare at the dark night sky above her. She couldn't see the stars. It was dark, but amidst the noise and roars, she heard a loud noise that sounded like an illusion. A mighty echo from afar rang out. It was a secret call that only she knew. The mountain shook. Within the blade, the ferocious spirit roared, echoing in her ears. At that moment, there was a loud sound of metal colliding, tearing apart everyone's eardrums. The girl in the gray dress stepped forward and cut through the ridiculous defense that was like duckweed. As the Mountain Lord's sword slashed, a hurricane burst forth and spread out violently. In an instant, the outcome was decided. A gentle trill rose from her hand like the sound of zither strings, adding a touch of indescribable gentleness to this tragic scene. The blood of struggle that belonged to the Yuan family gradually boiled in this melody, bringing an indescribable joy. In the reflection of the smooth blade, she saw a strange face. In the reflection, the girl was also looking at her. A cruel smile appeared on her beautiful face, and the color in her eyes gradually turned scarlet, no longer dignified. That was her. "Since it's your nature, why should I be afraid?" She whispered softly, closed her eyes, and exhaled the scorching heat in her lungs. But when that pair of eyes looked up again, they became cold and cruel, and there was no longer any warmth in them. The Mountain Lord in the cage roared silently, breaking free from the last shackle. "Sorry, I'm in a hurry." Yuan raised her eyes and hooked her finger at the enemies in front of her, issuing an invitation. "So, it doesn't matter if you all come together." She smiled at the angry faces. It was as if she had to bow to the audience before the start. This was the final etiquette. It didn't matter how many audience members there were. It didn't matter how enthusiastic they were. The performance of the predator had just begun. At that moment, the blade slashed down, and a cold chill spread with the silent melody, stealing the temperature, causing this coldness to seep into everyone's bones in an instant, like the arrival of a snowstorm. Under the gradually violent rhythm, everything was hurriedly moving towards a tragic end. It made people involuntarily tremble in the illusion of wind and snow. Concerto of Four Seasons, Winter, under the girl's sword. The performance that broke the barrier and sublimated again appeared here, spreading from the scene that was close to a massacre. Step by step, she moved forward, no matter how many enemies there were. The violent and solemn scene almost frightened all the souls that were watching. It crudely and straightforwardly transmitted this beauty that belonged to power and art to every trembling heart. He crushed all his opponents as easily as crushing dry weeds. Step by step, she defeated the people who blocked her way. The wounds left by the slashes of the blade couldn't stop her. Instead, the predator in the cold winter became more and more violent and cruel. Blood splashed on the gray dress like a burning flame in the fog. Roars and roars sounded continuously, and then quickly disappeared. Only the high-pitched sound of metal colliding and the low sound of people falling to the ground kept ringing. They couldn't use their eyes to catch the figure that was as swift as lightning. But when they closed their eyes and were no longer confused by the chaotic scene, they could feel the rhythm and beauty hidden in the slaughter. It's just like a performance. It's so beautiful. In the distance, on the top floor of a building, an old samurai looked from afar and couldn't help but sigh softly. Such skills are rare. Have you found out her origin? She should be someone from the Hybrid Alliance. It seems like she's a student of the King of Danwa. Another supervisor from the dojo replied, "To be able to teach such a talent, the King of Danwa can't be underestimated." Who didn't know that the leader of the alliance was never easy to deal with? At this moment, everyone suddenly showed a bitter smile. Now, it seems that the newly rebuilt Danwa wants to interfere with the matters of Yomi no Yomiban. The knife hunter is not limited to one place. As long as they come with a sword, regardless of good or evil, men or women, old or young, they can all try. This is the rule of the dojo. The old man lowered his eyes and stared at the girl covered in blood on the long street. What we need to do is to pay attention to the knife hunter. We don't need to care about other things now. They focused on admiring the beautiful scenery and praised the changes in the footwork and moves. Everyone here was a master and a genius who had been immersed in the dojo for many years. At this moment, even the opponents understand the preciousness included in her strategy, and all the complicated changes are consistent. Such exquisite control is really amazing. The person next to him sighed. Although I've seen many more tragic scenes, such a harsh duel and rapid victory and defeat, even Di Qing back then can't be compared to this, right? Di Qing? How can this be a strange monk? The old samurai shook his head and laughed. If you ask me, it's clearly a red leaf. For a moment, it was as if they were in the deep, demonic realm hidden in Shinjo. The ground was scarlet. It was impossible to tell whether it was the falling maple leaves or the fresh blood. Under the contrast of the maple leaves and the blood, the dignified and cold face also became coquettish. It was so charming, as if it had been dyed by the devil. However, this dazzling beauty, which was enough to hurt the eyes, came at the price of tragic casualties and wails. Someone sighed. Should we call the backup paramedics? No need, the old samurai said indifferently. The trash who can't even win in a group fight should crawl to the hospital by themselves. At least they'll learn their lesson. Besides, isn't no one dead? Everyone fell into silence. It was unbelievable. But when they widened their eyes to take a closer look, they found that it was just as Shifu Dai had said. It looked so tragic, but in fact, there was still no death under the blade of the sword. Even in the face of such a huge gap between the enemy and herself, in such a chaotic duel, she still left room for her opponent. That was not letting the tiger return to the mountain. At best, she was just letting the tiger hurt people. The shackles that controlled the nature of the struggle were still in her hands. She could control and release them freely. She had never lost control. The younger generation will surpass us in time. The old samurai sighed, waved his sleeves, and turned to leave. She had already foreseen the result. There would be no suspense at all. As early as the moment she carried the chair here, it was destined that there would only be one winner on Central Avenue tonight. 10 minutes later, Yuan calmly waved her hand and shook off the last trace of sticky blood on the blade. Yamagun once again returned to the cage. So docile. In the dead silence, behind her, the people of Huai Yamagata carried a stretcher and put the last unconscious samurai into an ambulance and took him away. Only a spreading blood red and countless mournful iron lights were left. The total number of swords and knives, 371. Forrest Hutt pushed the sunglasses on the bridge of his nose and clapped his hands in admiration. Congratulations, Yuan. You've become famous in one battle. In less than an hour, the knife-hunting incident on Central Avenue set off an unprecedented impact in Yasaka. In less than 20 minutes, more than 16 samurai who embarked on the path of knife hunting were tragically defeated here. A total of 92 challengers ushered in the most complete defeat in front of one person. The name Hung Yeji spread like wildfire and spread to everyone's ears. Many people woke up and looked at Danbua in amazement, marveling at the style of the leader of the alliance, wondering whether this heralded the arrival of a new round of storm. In the treatment room under the Stone Marrow Museum, Huaisher bit the suture scissors and pulled the suture with tweezers in his hand to make a beautiful bow. Finally, he cut off the excess with scissors. It's done. You'll be fine after 2 days of rest. It won't leave a scar. Huaisher put down the tools, reached out, and rubbed Yuan's hair. Thank you for your hard work. Do you want to eat supper? Yuan thought for a moment and nodded. Okay. She couldn't help but smile when she followed her teacher, because she secretly did something bad without letting her teacher know. Under the night sky, Forrest Hutt hung up the phone and couldn't help but rub his hands. He was full of expectations. He was going to do something bad. Chapter 8:13. After a night of hustle and bustle, the knife hunt continues, and the battles continue to be staged everywhere in Yoshitaka. But in some places, it's quiet as usual. In the courtyard facing the tea house, under the infusion of water, the sound of deer is heard. Above the white sand, there are plum blossoms falling on the dark rocks. The slightly old samurai holds the teacup and quietly stares at the distant scenery, comprehending Zen. His movement pauses for a moment. He looks at the door of the tea house. Behind the paper door, there is a soft sound of footsteps approaching slowly. The visitor stops outside the door and doesn't hide his existence. He just waits respectfully. After the samurai finishes his tea, the visitor gently knocks on the door and respectfully reports, "Teacher Sato, disciple Yamanaka Furuya boldly asks to see you." Sato puts down the teacup and asks indifferently, "Why didn't you knock at the beginning?" The young man outside the door bows his head. I dare not disturb your elegant interest. Sato smiles. It wasn't some kind of precious relic from the border. You don't disturb me now? But after decades of nurturing by an expert in the way of more respectful. The teapot had already given birth to its own origin substance. It's really difficult to be at ease, making it rarer. I'm afraid I have no chance from the border. It was truly a rare and elegant Sato thing. Breathes a sigh of relief, Suotong did not like people who sought personal gain. He could not help but feel happy when such an exquisite teapot was placed in front of him. Especially now, as the young man Yamanaka of the judge of the teapot was pushed in front of Sato. They become more and more attentive. It was close at hand. Even the tea house where he occasionally takes a break and looked at the ancient visited and the weathered body of the cauldron, revealing he couldn't help but reach out his hand kneeling outside and gently touch it. He wears the uniform of the dojo chill in his hand and carries a and his nose seemed to smell the scabbard fragrance of tea. It doesn't look like a murder weapon. And wonderful like thing. A work of art. After a long silence, although there are traces finally raised his holding a sword on his fingers, his expression became there are no serious. Calluses. If you give it to an old man like martial arts skills, I'm afraid it'll be like a pearl covered in dust. Right? Since you're here, Yamanaka couldn't help but shake his head. I dare smile. Yamanaka raises his hand, so wipes the sweat on his forehead, and left a good impression from beside him. In the end, I just came in and found something. Yamanaka I dare not cherish without losing his composure. Please examine it, teacher Sato. In the eyes of those who like it, Sato doesn't naturally precious. He just wants to wave his hand. But in the eyes of those who don't like it, let him get out with his things. Only see it as trash. However, the young man's that there are many fine feats. He opened the exquisite box. Yes, and slowly pushed the item in the box forward. When Suotong heard this, Sato's raised he recalled the difficult years between the soft brocade and was filled with emotion. The ancient teapot revealed its true appearance. His eyes suddenly had been forged from black as he looked at the disciple but its design in front of him. Indescribably delicate Yamanaka and light. You compare me to bow scale-like patterns on its surface contained strands of origin substance. The young man lowered his eyes, quiet and respectfully replied. I don't dare ask to immediately feel I only hope that I can listen to your teachings from time to time. I go to the dojo every Friday. If I want to teach, why don't I see you in my class? Of course, I hope that you can see me in a different light. When he said this, the young man raised his head and let the teacher in front of him look at him with sharp eyes. He hid the trembling of his fingers and wanted to show his backbone. Suotong was silent for a moment, and then laughed softly. Very good, Yamanaka-kun. He said, I'll accept the teapot. I'll see your performance. Then I'll take my leave. The young man politely said goodbye and took 2 steps back. Finally, he bowed again and gently closed the door for him. The sound of footsteps gradually faded away. In the silence, Suotong looked down at the teapot in the box. After a long time, he took out his phone and dialed his colleague's number. This is Tung Ping. It's me. Suotong opened his mouth and asked, I remember that you have a disciple called Yamanaka Furuya. Yamanaka? Tung Ping thought for a moment. There are so many disciples in the dojo. I don't have much of an impression. But I remember that there was a Yamanaka who spent money to donate. His family is from the Honshu Agricultural Association and has plenty of money. He didn't attend many classes, but he mixed in with a group of bad friends. But he has a sense of propriety and hasn't caused any trouble. Tung Ping asked, is he going to follow your path? Yes, Suotong said calmly. If his performance is good, it's not bad to take him in as an official disciple. Tung Ping on the other side of the phone immediately understood. Then you'll have to treat me. Every year at this time, there were many disciples who came out to do activities like this. They wanted to find a way to improve themselves or to seek other positions. And the teachers naturally wouldn't be too heartless. If possible, they would often be merciful. There were too many people in the world. It wasn't rare for everyone to take what they wanted, especially disciples like Yamanaka. He knew propriety and knew when to advance and retreat. He was generous and respectful to his teachers. Teaching him would naturally have endless benefits. But of course, accepting a disciple couldn't be so careless. It was only based on a chance meeting. Naturally, it would take a long time to make sure that the disciple wouldn't cause trouble for himself before being officially considered. And during this period, it was time for the disciple to perform. Zhuotung narrowed his eyes and couldn't help but feel expectant. And the speed of this cheap disciple, who hadn't even taken any action yet, was much faster than he had imagined. According to the surveillance video, at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, he had already set up his stall at the entrance of the dojo, just 3 minutes before Zhuotung arrived. Teacher Zhuotung. In front of the dojo's entrance, Zhuotung didn't even raise his head when he heard a majestic, sonorous, and energetic greeting. He was so shocked that he almost pulled out his sword. He raised his head and took a glance. Only then did he realize that it was the young man who bowed respectfully in front of the door. He remembered his name was Yamanaka's house. They met again so soon. That shout was so loud that it attracted the attention of the surrounding people, as well as the disciples passing by inside and outside the dojo. Their eyes were filled with curiosity. Yamanaka was stunned for a moment. Then he understood in his heart and couldn't help but smile. This little fellow is actually using me to create momentum right now. He could see that in the basket behind him, there were hundreds of famous swords scattered around. The number was quite astonishing. He could feel the aura left by the martial artists who had been immersed in them for a long time. There was no doubt that they were all genuine. He suddenly understood in his heart. Although he didn't know where he got so many samurai swords and how much he spent, he was afraid that he was also thinking of making a name for himself this time. Sure enough, he was very thoughtful. That was why he wanted to do what he liked. If he, as one of the judges of the knife hunt, could give him a push from behind, he would be sure to win this time. In the future, he would be able to become famous among his peers. Unfortunately, the young man was still a little inexperienced after all. How could Zhuotung not see it? This young man seemed calm and solemn, but his heart and pulse were in a mess. He was already sweating nervously. Teacher Zhuotung's expression became serious. Yamanaka. Suddenly, Yamanaka's house trembled and bowed its head. Disciple is here. Looking at his trembling appearance, Zhuotung smiled, reached out, and patted him on the shoulder. Young people should guard against arrogance and impatience. Don't bite off more than you can chew. Although he didn't intend to ruin things, he still had to give him a warning. But after the warning, he also had to encourage him more. Otherwise, wouldn't he be doing a favor for free? In this way, in front of many disciples, Zhuotung encouraged him. Do your best, Yamanaka. The future depends on you. Yamanaka was stunned for a moment and immediately became ecstatic and responded loudly, yes. Feeling the longing gaze from beside him, Zhuotung smiled slightly and turned to walk into the dojo. Being sensible and polite can make money, especially with ideas. This future inner disciple of his may have a great future. He thought so. Yamanaka's house had been respectfully standing in place and bowing until Master Zhuotung walked away. Then he slowly straightened up and felt the subtle gazes from around him. Some indifference, some mockery, and some hostility, seeing a disciple who they had never seen before bring back so many results and even get the praise of the judges. The other disciples' hearts suddenly felt uncomfortable. A disciple who had just returned from a knife hunt with more than 70 blades slowly walked up with a sneer. Hey, you look very unfamiliar. Yamanaka stood in place and withdrew his gaze from the direction where Master Zhuotung left. His expression changed from a smile to indifference. He glanced at the newcomer and asked, Do you think I find you familiar? The newcomer was suddenly angry, but before he could do anything, Yamanaka's house picked up the registration board and held a pen in his hand and impatiently asked, How many blades? The disciple who was looking for trouble was stunned and didn't understand. Are you here to have fun with me? Bastard, Yamanaka's expression suddenly became angry. The pen in his hand knocked on the board, and he was almost angry. I asked you how many blades. Didn't you go to the knife hunt? Don't make trouble for third-year students. The young man patted the table and said unhappily, I'm here to register. The disciple who was looking for trouble was stunned for a long time and finally reacted. Register? Register what? Of course, it's the result of the knife hunt. Yamanaka picked his nose. Everyone stays here to register the number. These days, you guys came back here to report the number, and you lost so many blades. Do you think Masterswa is the accountant? The gentlemen are already sick of it. Otherwise, why would they ask me to do this job? Masterswa just came to inspect the task. Didn't you come? What about me? Yamanaka coldly pointed to the big baskets and boxes beside him. Put the things there and report the number yourself. Don't lie. I have a count here. With that, he patted the blackboard behind him, and suddenly the names and the number of blades appeared on it. He impatiently glanced at the newcomer, waiting for him to answer. His heart was in his throat. Under the second-hand dojo uniform he bought, his calves and stomach began to twitch. He was ready to run away at any time. 71 blades. The newcomer was shocked by his angry look and finally seemed to understand. He subconsciously followed his command and put the blades in the box, letting him take them away. With Masterswa's testimony, no one doubted the origin of this person. Anyway, this was the dojo's entrance. No one would be bold enough to play tricks under the Sword Saint's eyes, right? The answer was there. Chapter 8:14. It didn't matter if it was the hut in the mountain or the hut in the forest. The young man behind the desk clenched his fists in his sleeves in excitement. He was halfway there, but he couldn't let his guard down yet. The most important thing had just begun. Half an hour. He only had half an hour. In this half an hour, the disciples he had bribed to distract would not return for the time being. The teachers of the dojo were also having a meeting about the results of this knife hunt and the following arrangements. No one would be crazy enough to rush in and disturb him. Several respected seniors had already returned to the academy. The only two who liked to hang out had been arranged by the hut in the forest to go to the biggest nightclubs and casinos in Ginza and Yellow Springs. On the last afternoon of the last day, this half an hour was the last time the hut in the forest fought for, with all his might. He relied on the fake teapot he had bought from his uncle at a discount to blackmail Yamanaka. Then he impersonated him and finally borrowed 240 knives from Yuan as capital. This was the hut in the forest gamble. It was a lie that could be easily exposed. He had never registered in the dojo. As soon as he walked through the gate, the alarm would go off and expose him. Now, at this moment, in front of the gate, it was time to reap the harvest. As time flew by, more and more students returned from the knife hunt and were attracted by the crowd in front of the gate. They obediently followed the guidance of others and presented their hunting results with both hands. Rose to the top of the list. They didn't doubt his authenticity enjoying the excited gazes from all around him. They were respectful to his arrogance. Proudly. However, Yamanaka, his smile didn't last long before a new champion was born. The hut in the forest looked up and glanced at the nervous newcomer. He scratched his ear and said, 3 years old, lower your voice. 241. I can't hear you. Kenya's smile froze for a moment. Louder. Then he noticed the disciples around the dojo who were watching the show suddenly became this noisy. Guy. He's still fighting with disciple scolded angrily. He clenched his fist in the dojo. If a fourth-year student says he can't hear you, he can't hear you. Go find the others. The disciple and help me gather a few knives. And stiffened. Today, he tried to raise his voice. I must let Kuroto understand who's the real number. Okay, next. One among the third-year students. In the forest applauded soon and waved his sides, mobilized signaling the volunteer behind and began to gather the empty knives and in the hands of the other disciples and replace it with a new competition under the next person was already prepared. The smile on the hut raised his voice and shouted with all his might. No, it's getting out of hand. Good,
Things
very energetic.
already out of my
The little
control.
hut in the woods was
Less than
overjoyed.
20 minutes had
He
passed.
patted the blackboard
In theory,
beside him.
there were still
Suddenly,
10 minutes of
the
safe
words
time.
on the board changed.
However, he
the
couldn't
top 10
completely
names on
follow
the
the
leaderboard
plan.
changed.
No matter how
the original
thorough the
fourth
plan
place was pushed
there
down
would always
and
be
replaced
flaws
by
and
a new
accidents.
name. At the
He
back
had
of
to
the
make a
crowd,
decision.
a disciple
hut
who
in the
was
woods
watching
put down the
suddenly
registration
changed his
board in his
expression.
hand.
His
and
ranking
passed
was
the pen
actually
to another
pushed
student
down.
he
But
called
then
over to help
there
him
were
move
shouts
the
of
items.
excitement
While
and
no one was paying
exclamations
attention
from the crowd.
he quietly retreated, but just as he was about to walk out of the crowd and disappear, a large hand suddenly pressed down on his shoulder. He held on tightly, so forceful. Wait! A hoarse voice came from behind. The hut in the woods calmly turned around and looked at the gloomy Kano behind him. The samurai raised his hand and said impatiently, "I still have 2 knives that haven't been registered yet." The hut in the woods held his stomach and smiled awkwardly. "Sorry, my stomach hurts a little. I've already assigned the registration to Iwata Jr. You can look for him." Oh. Kano let go of his hand and looked at the direction he went with confusion. "The toilet in the dojo is not far away. Why are you walking out?" The hut in the woods immediately became nervous. What if Sensei finds out that I'm not doing my job? Don't talk nonsense, Kano Jr. I'll be back soon. Okay. Kano nodded and let go of his hand. After taking 2 steps, the hut in the woods suddenly turned around and pointed at the busy registration area. "By the way, can I ask Kano Jr. to help me temporarily? I'm afraid he won't be able to handle it alone. The sensei, who was supposed to help, is injured and can't come." Don't worry. Leave it to me." Kano immediately patted his chest and showed a sincere and reliable smile. He watched the hut in the woods disappear into the distance. Then he returned to the registration area and began to work diligently to protect his precious position at the top of the list. Come. Let's all register. This disciple, how many knives do you have?" However, in the midst of the busy registration, he quickly had a new doubt in his mind. Is the ranking list incomplete? He knew that several people had already completed the knife hunt, and their results were all above his. Could this be the ranking list for the day? It's just like the weekly Abyss rankings in mobile games. How strange. I'll just ask Yamanaka Sr. when he comes back. While he was busy working, an angry roar came from behind the crowd. "You bastards! What the hell are you doing here?" The angry Sato rushed out of the dojo. "You dare to cause trouble during Sensei's meeting? If it wasn't for the doorman reporting to me, I would have been kept in the dark. Hey, you, what are you doing?" Kano's expression stiffened as he was stared at by a pair of angry and thunderous eyes. Then he said innocently, "I'm just helping with the registration." Registration? Sato froze for a moment and realized that something was wrong. He looked at their table and the boxes piled up behind them, and a shadow of uneasiness appeared in his heart. Registration for what? Didn't you say that Yamanaka-senpai should register the results of the knife hunt? Kano asked in confusion. "You see, we're doing well. We even ordered a ranking list." Sato was stunned for a long time, and when he finally reacted, he felt blood rushing to his head, and his vision turned dark. Nonsense! He couldn't help but roar. When did I say such a thing?" Infuriated, Sato couldn't restrain himself. He raised his hand and slapped Kenya's face. Kenya was sent flying into the air. He spun in the air and smashed into the frame behind him. It was a mess. Under the violent collision, the sword phantoms suddenly trembled, and as Kano struggled to get up, they disappeared into thin air. They disappeared. There were only empty boxes left, still rolling around on the ground. It was as if they were gigantic mouths that were mocking him, letting out a silent sneer. Dead silence. Dead silence. What are you still standing there for?" Sato raised his head, his face pale, but his eyes were bloodshot, like the flames of hell burning. "Find him! Find him! Find that
bastard Yamanaka for me." His roar echoed through most of Yoshimi Ryasaka, filled with killing intent. "I will tear him to pieces." On the other side of Yoshimi Ryasaka, in a speeding car, Janako Hut felt waves of resentment pouring into his body and couldn't help but moan in pleasure. So comfortable. He tore off his disguise and the seal that shackled his origin substance and returned to his original appearance. Looking at his watch, he found that he had been exposed for 10 minutes longer than expected, but he didn't think that he should have waited a bit longer to get a better result. Instead, he was scared, and his hands and legs were trembling. Playing tricks in front of the Sword Saint dojo wasn't something that a human could do, especially when he left. He could clearly feel the gaze from the deepest part of the dojo looking at him. It was so meaningful. He trembled as he lit the cigarette at the corner of his mouth, pulled a piece of tissue, and wiped the cold sweat on his forehead. His hands trembled faster and faster. Scared. Oh my God, that was too exciting. He flicked the cigarette ash out of the car window, sped up, and returned to the scene. But behind him, an unexpected voice came from the back seat of the car. A young girl wearing a traditional Ingzhou robe had appeared there at some point. She raised her face and looked at his twitching expression, and asked curiously, "You pretended to be someone from the dojo and cheated at the dojo's entrance. Aren't you afraid of death?" "Of course I'm afraid." Janako Hut shrugged, smoking, and asked, "But if I'm afraid of death, won't I die?" As if shocked by his foolishness, the young girl thought for a moment and said seriously, "If you surrender now, I can plead for you in front of Grandpa." "Plead for me?" Janako Hut raised his eyebrows, feeling a chill on his back. He couldn't help but laugh. "Sorry." The young man raised his hand and took a deep puff of his cigarette, then spat out the smoke and spoke. "It's too late, whether it's mending the pen after the sheep is lost, or your naive capture." At that moment, he lifted his foot and stepped on the accelerator. The car instantly accelerated to the limit that the body of the car could bear. Then, he turned the steering wheel and rampaged across the bridge. With a loud roar, the guardrail of the bridge was destroyed, and the car rushed straight into the surging river below. Then he disappeared. The river, known as the Yellow Springs, was filled with the precipitation of hell. It was red and yellow all year round, and was known as the Yellow Springs. It was still surging rapidly, swallowing everything. It didn't take long for the huge monster, hidden in the river, to devour the car that had fallen from the sky. The young girl who had rushed out of the window at the last moment looked down at Julian from the gap in the guardrails, narrowing her eyes. After a long time, she sheathed her small knife and chuckled softly. "We'll definitely meet again in the future anyway, so I'll let you go this time." She turned and left. Under the bridge, Janako Hut was holding on to half of a steel bar, hanging in midair. His trembling hands slowly loosened. The last puff of his cigarette fell from the sky and into the river. It was swallowed by the surging shadows in the river. After the last twists and turns, Janako Hut carefully lurked all the way. After changing his identity twice, he finally returned to the present world as a tourist. He didn't even have time to catch his breath as he rushed straight to Donbua. It wasn't until he reached the Stone Essence Hall that he could finally breathe a sigh of relief. He was so weak that he couldn't even walk. "Hey, you're back, kid?" Elder Luo, who was still teaching Yuan in the courtyard, grinned. "I won't let you escape this time. Are you ready for the remedial lesson from hell?" "Sorry, no. Goodbye." Janako Hut waved his hand, casually taking off his backpack and unzipping it. In an instant, countless swords and knives gushed out like a tide. They piled up like a small mountain beside him. It was even taller than him. 1,691 knives. After deducting the 400 that I promised to return to Yuan, I still have 1,200. I'm the champion of this knife hunt. The teenager raised his head and glanced at the elder's stunned expression. He asked loudly, I'm the 9th son of the Lin family. Do I need to suck up to others? In the silence, Elder Luo pinched his chin and looked at this sudden surprise. He sighed but didn't say anything. He just waved his hand and let the proud teenager go. Although he was sneaky, at least he could come back alive and did a good job. He had already graduated. Janako Hut finally won against the muscular old man. Janako Hut was so excited that his feet floated and his eyebrows danced. He pushed the door open and collapsed on the sofa. When he smelled the fragrance coming from the kitchen, he suddenly became more courageous. Feng Shu, I want to eat chicken drumsticks. He shouted. I want to eat the biggest one. Okay, wait a moment. The elder in the kitchen responded warmly and sped up his movements. But when Feng Shu came out of the kitchen with a plate, he found that the teenager, lying on the sofa, had already fallen asleep and was snoring thunderously. He was also covered with a blanket. Huai Shi, who was sitting next to him, raised his hand and gestured for him to speak softly. The elder nodded, put down the roast chicken in his hand, and left with a smile. Chapter 8:15. The next day, in the afternoon, Huai Shi was lazily lying in his office, flipping through the documents in front of him that basically only needed his signature. Once again, he felt the emptiness and boredom of life. Suddenly, he bid farewell to the exciting adventure life, started to make money, and went to the peak of life. It seemed that there was only downhill to go after that. It was okay for a day or two, but after a long time, he began to feel the itch. He owed it. How can this be the end? Huai Shi looked up at the sky and sighed. The secretary couldn't help but shake his head. You must be joking, Mr. Huai Shi. Everyone hopes that such days will never end. Huai Shi was about to speak when he heard a knock on the office door. Downhill looked serious. He walked in and was about to speak when he saw that the secretary didn't say anything. The secretary got up and went out on the pretext of making tea. What's wrong? Why are you so serious? Huai Shi looked up from the sofa. Boss, the people from the dojo are here. Oh, let them come. Huai Shi shrugged. Domwood didn't set up any checkpoints or roadblocks. They can go around if they want. Downhill coughed. They are here for you. What for? Huai Shi smiled curiously. Are they here for me to participate in the knife hunt? They sent someone to ask if we had anything to do with yesterday's incident. They are very arrogant. Downhill said gloomily, If you ask me, this kind of groundless thing. His words were interrupted by Huai Shi. The young man on the sofa slowly got up and said seriously, But we did do it, didn't we? Downhill was stunned. Huai Shi spread his hands. Since you did it, then do it openly and seriously. There is no need to hide the head and show the tail. Just tell them that I asked someone to do it. Isn't that enough? He was the one who said that the disciple should take care of the master when he had something to do and send the student to participate in the knife hunt. It was impossible for him to fall out with the student now that the student had some achievements, right? I arranged it. He said, No need to talk nonsense. After hesitating for a long time, the foot of the mountain lowered his head and said, They want us to hand over the perpetrator and bring him back to the training hall. In fact, the description at the foot of the mountain was already very polite. The arrogant attitude of the visitor was no longer the attitude a guest should have. Instead, it was as if the visitor had come to condemn someone from a higher position. There was a lot of impoliteness in his words as well. His arrogant and bossy manner had crushed many people's teeth. If it weren't for the fact that there was a person at the foot of the mountain who could see the big picture, Huai Shi's group would probably have fought with all their might. Huaisher, on the other hand, was still eating melon seeds, full of confusion. There was only a crisp sound in the room. In my opinion, the word accident is used very strangely. Huaisher calmly asked, "Did my student do something against the rules?" The people at the foot of the mountain were stunned and speechless. He didn't know how his boss's brain worked. What did he do that was against the rules? What did he do that was against the rules from the beginning to the end? What little hut in the woods did yesterday had already spread throughout the entire Ingzhou. It could be said that his reputation had spread far and wide. Who knew how many warriors from training halls regarded this as a great shame? It was simply the biggest scandal since the establishment of the training hall. If it weren't for Huaisher's noble status that couldn't be belittled, who knew how many people would have come knocking on his door? It could only be said that newborn calves were not afraid of tigers. The people of the Lin family all had the talent to offend people to death. And without a doubt, Little Hut in the Woods was the most outstanding one. After combining the two specialties of the Lin family and his teacher, he began to surpass his teacher. After swindling more than 1,000 swords in front of the gate of the training hall, he padded his, and went home, leaving behind an old teapot that had been soaked in a cesspool for several months. It was as if he had danced an entire new treasure island right under the nose of the sword sage. The image vividly showed the way the words reckless were written. Hearing Huaisher's words, not to mention the people at the foot of the mountain, even the two so-called training hall messengers waiting outside the gate suddenly turned livid with anger. They almost pulled out their swords to shame their master. But the problem is, they didn't say that it was impossible. Huaisher patted the melon seed in his hand and asked with an innocent face, "There have been so many cases of people being beaten up, drugged, and even robbed of their swords in the immortal jump. They didn't care about any of them. Why would they care about my child? Besides, weren't they very good at playing this trick in Aikdaya House back then? Oh, I forgot. The people who were killed in Aikdaya House back then seemed to be students of the training hall. You say, it's been so many years. Why don't they remember? They're too stupid and gullible to blame us, right?" "Enough is enough, Your Excellency Huaisher." The middle-aged warrior behind the door tightly pressed the hilt of his sword and roared angrily, "To what extent are you going to humiliate us?" "I'm just stating facts and reasoning." "Is that called humiliating?" Huaisher retorted coldly. "My student accepted the swords personally handed over by the disciples in front of the gate of the training hall according to the rules of the Knife Hunter Association. Which rule, which section, or which section of your rules state that no one is allowed to wander around your gate." As he spoke, he raised his eyes. His gaze seemed to penetrate the door and fell on the faces of the people behind the door. He solemnly and seriously told them, "If my student has violated any rules, the training hall can tell me. I will punish him severely without mercy. But if you want me to hand over my student for some groundless reason, then why don't you just ask me to kowtow to the sword saint and beg for forgiveness?" Huaisher said, "Anyway, isn't the effect the same?" In the silence, the middle-aged warrior angrily pulled out his sword, but his wrist was tightly pressed by his companion beside him. The sharp sword could not be unsheathed. Beside him, the younger warrior nodded and responded respectfully, "Your criticism is right. Today we were rash. When we go back, we will pass on your words word by word." In this way, he watched the two leave. Huaisher could not help but sigh and looked at the corner. "It's all because of you, Teacher Luo." In the shadow of the corner, an old man appeared out of nowhere. He looked like he had just returned from working out, with a wet towel on his shoulder. He was sweating all over. He was looking at him sideways. "What nonsense are you talking about?" Elder Luo asked. "I didn't ask your kid to court death in front of the Sword Saint Gate. If you ask me, your student is exactly the same as you, at least in terms of courting death. He has the tendency to surpass his teacher." Even without little 19, isn't the result the same? Huaisha rolled his eyes. Yuan, an outsider, had trampled on the faces of so many disciples of the dojo to make a name for herself. Would the dojo let this go? Not to mention that the dojo was petty. If someone from the looming hall came to the Danbo inner circle to participate in the Extreme Dao Union meeting and told Huaisha that he wanted to fight 10 people, Huaisha would feel disgusted. "What are you trying to do, stinky little brother? Do you really think I'm dead?" Elder Luo's orders and actions were equivalent to triggering the friction between Danbo inner circle and Yomi no Kuni in advance. It made the two strong neighbors, who were close to each other, realize the threat of each other. Not to mention whether little 19 had broken the rules of the training hall or not. Just his exaggerated result of 1,200 rounds was something that the training hall would never tolerate or acknowledge. The people who came today to ask him to hand over little 19 was merely a test. He wanted to figure out whether this was Huaisha's idea or whether the hut in the forest was acting recklessly. At the same time, he wanted to save face and force Huaisha to bow to the Taoist sanctum. Even if he did, Huaisha wouldn't be able to get anything out of it. What's more, Huaisha didn't have the habit of treating his students as cannon fodder. After today, it would be difficult for the two sides to coexist peacefully. But little 19 couldn't help but be stubborn this time. It was time for the student to become famous. As a teacher, how could he stop him? Compared to this, he was more concerned about Elder Luo's purpose. "You're so happy to stir up trouble between Danbo inner circle and the Taoist sanctum. What do you want to do?" Huaisha pinched his chin and looked at the old man in front of him. "Don't tell me you're going to fight with the Sword Saint." As soon as he said this, he was amused by himself. But Elder Luo didn't laugh. Instead, he looked at Huaisha calmly. "Yes," he said. Huaisha's whole body was numb, and he was stunned. "Really?" "Of course it's true. Would anyone joke about this kind of thing?" The old man asked doubtfully. "I remember, didn't you ask me who was stronger, the Sword Saint or me? Now you're scared. This isn't your style." "Nonsense. I have a big family now. How many people depend on me to make a living? Would I dare to be reckless?" Huaisha couldn't help but roll his eyes. "Besides, I'm not afraid that Danbo inner circle can't beat the Taoist sanctum. I'm afraid that you can't beat the Sword Saint. Okay?" Back then, Elder Luo punched his own teacher into the abyss. He was happy, but in the end, his own path of ascension was broken, and there was no possibility of advancement. No matter how strong the lactic acid accumulation supreme was, it was useless if you couldn't beat the opponent. On the other hand, the Sword Saint had been famous for hundreds of years, a fifth-grade legendary figure, and there were many experts among his disciples. In Yingzhou, it was a colossus on the level of the Five Mountains sword sect. Just the Taoist sanctum alone was comparable to 2 mountains, almost like Shaolin and Wudong. On the other hand, Elder Luo couldn't have more than one Jinluan Fuwang. Huaisha was at most a de Erba. What was this old man thinking in his head? But the biggest problem now was that if he insisted on doing things his own way, Huaisha couldn't change his mind. The only thing he could do now was to quickly invite Xianlai Buddha. Elder Luo looked up and glanced at him, knowing what this guy was thinking. Xiaoxian should have gone to Lopner these 2 days, and she should be arriving in India soon. There's no signal on her phone. You don't have to contact her anymore. So you came at the right time. Huaisha was dumbfounded. After a long silence, he finally couldn't help but hit the table in anger. "I say, Teacher Luo, this is not right. He frowned and asked, "If you want to arm wrestle with the Sword Saint, you can just call me. If you lose, you can go back to Dongsha, and I can go back to the astronomy club. We still have a bright future. But why are you involving so many people now?" Once the conflict got out of hand, there would be no room for reconciliation between the Taoist sanctum and Donbua inner circle. When the time came, the collision between the two colossi would cause a lot of waves, and it would definitely not be a good thing for Donbua inner circle. Huai sure did all she could to pull them out of hell, but it wasn't for her to lead them to their deaths. "Don't worry, I won't touch your baby." Elder Luo glanced at him. "I don't have the habit of asking others to help me fight. At most, I'll just use you to say hello at the knife hunt. Do you think he doesn't know that I'm in the capital? I'm afraid that the tricks of the Lin family are under his nose, but he still came back in one piece, didn't he?" The old man picked up the thermos and sipped a mouthful of protein powder. "Don't panic, he wants to thank you." "Thank him?" Huaishur was so angry that he laughed. Rather than expecting the Sword Saint to thank him, he'd rather kill the Golden Dawn. However, less than 2 hours after the old man finished speaking, the messenger of the dojo came again in a hurry. Instead of his previous arrogance, he respectfully presented the 3 invitations. All of them were handwritten by the Sword Saint. The thin invitations seemed to be very heavy. With Huaishur's almost no calligraphy skills, he couldn't see the beauty of the calligraphy on them. But at least he could recognize what was written on them. As if nothing had happened, the Sword Saint Shangchuan warmly invited Huaishur and his 2 extraordinary disciples to attend the celebration banquet. He even acknowledged the achievements of Forest Hut and Yuan Yuan. He personally appointed Yuan Yuan as the first place of the knife hunt trial, although Forest Hut wasn't ranked as the first place because of her lack of sword skills. She was only ranked behind Yuan Yuan. He even praised her courage. Huaishur held the invitations, turned them upside down, turned them over, and looked at them with a magnifying glass, but he didn't understand what the Sword Saint meant. He only saw 3 words written in between the lines. "Thank you for your support." "See, I was right? Elder Luo laughed strangely. "You don't need to bleed or sweat. You just need to sit, listen to the music, eat and drink well, and finally take the gifts and leave. Maybe they'll send you directly to the door and welcome you next time." With that, he picked up the thermos flask and walked away while humming a song. Huaishur was left alone in the same place, stunned. He didn't understand. What were these 2 old men doing? Chapter 8:16. "Teacher, what are you doing?" Little Hut in the Woods was also dumbfounded. He looked at Huaishur and Yuan Yuan, who had already changed into formal attire, and then at himself, who had hurriedly changed into casual clothes after receiving the teacher's notice, packed his belongings, and even dragged a small suitcase. "What's wrong with your outfit?" Huaishur was stunned. "Didn't you say that the sword master sent us an invitation to go to the dojo?" Little Hut in the Woods' expression twitched. "I thought you meant for me to run away quickly. I've already found a contact at the border. First, he would go from Benjo to Jojo, and then from the border to hell. Through a secret route, he could quickly return to the nearest safe house of the Lin family, and then wait for the elders of the Lin family to pick him up. After hiding for a while, he would come out as a good man again. Let's not talk about why your escape plan is so comprehensive. What's wrong with your train of thought?" Huaishur rolled his eyes and ordered Shanya find someone to take him to fix him. How can he attend the banquet with such a dirty face? "Do you really want to attend?" Little Hut in the Woods was in disbelief. "Why not?" Huaishur asked. "You attended the knife hunt and were given an invitation. Little 19, this is a great opportunity for you to show your face, but you only want to run away?" "I'm just panicking." "What are you panicking about? I'm here." Huaishur gave him a flying kick. "Go." Little Hut in the Woods turned around and stopped talking. It's because you're here that I'm panicking, okay? As soon as he saw the invitation, Little Hut in the Woods began to think of all kinds of messy keywords. Hongmen banquet, last meal, eat something good. It was followed by a lot of nonsense like Xiang Zhuang wielding a sword, meaning Peigong. He was too familiar with this. He used himself as an excuse to lure the teacher over, prepared a trap, and then suddenly turned hostile and took action. Okay, don't think about that nonsense. Seeing that the kid still had that shifty-eyed look on his face after cleaning up, Huaisher couldn't help but get angry. Have some backbone. Today is a good day for all of you. Show some arrogance. One is number one. The other is number two. Why are they so shameful? Little Hut in the Woods laughed awkwardly. I'm just worried that they might be up to no good. Don't worry. Since he sent out the invitation,
it was a world guaranteed
we are
by the
guests of the
Astronomical
Training
Society,
Hall. No
and
matter who
protected
gets
by
into
the
trouble
three
tonight,
great
the
blockades.
dojo will lose
If
face.
an organization couldn't even
Huaisher
maintain its
glanced at
basic
him
morals
and said,
attitude,
at most,
then it wouldn't
they'll
be
make
far
things
from
difficult
collapse.
for you.
It
But
was
it
impossible
depends
for
on
the
your own
dojo
performance.
to not understand
There
this
was no
principle,
need to worry,
since it had
about
been able to
anything that
stand
could
in
not be
Inzhou for
brought to
so many
light.
years.
Deception
Don't
and
worry.
deceit might work
Go
in
in
the
a
borders
dignified
of hell,
manner.
but in the
No one will
present
be able to
world,
stop you tonight.
everyone wanted to save face.
Huaisher reached
in the
out
end,
and
the
patted
present
him on the
realm
shoulder.
was still a
I'll
society
take care of
trust.
everything.
Little Hut in the Woods was stunned for a moment. He wanted to say something, but stopped. Huaisher walked ahead with a smile and didn't wait for him to speak again. Little Hut in the Woods was stunned in place. After a long time, he chased after him. Only his panicked mood had calmed down at some point. He waited in peace. Then, when he arrived at the place and saw the familiar archway, he began to panic again. It was as if he was being taken by the police to identify the crime scene. His scalp was numb. He didn't know why, but when he thought of the strange woman who had chased after him a few days ago, he felt like a cat whose tail had been stepped on. He wanted to run away. Welcome, Mr. Huaisher, to guide us. As soon as the car door opened, the disciples in front of the gate of the dojo bent down and saluted respectfully, but their voices were unusually loud. Suddenly, the disciples on both sides of the dojo bowed in unison. Their voices shook the sky, but their serious expressions didn't seem to be welcoming. Instead, they seemed to be going to fight a formidable enemy. They were very serious. In an instant, he saw a dense crowd. The spirit that had been accumulated in the dojo for hundreds of years seemed to come along with the crowd, making him breathless. You're all quite energetic. It's good. Huaisher stepped on the ground and waved his hand lightly. Yuan followed him expressionlessly, and Little Hut in the Woods, who looked calm but was actually panicking, especially him. The divine mark on the path of evil karma could feel how much malice was directed at him here. It was a hatred that couldn't wait to tear him into pieces. If they were thousands of miles away, Little Hut in the Woods would definitely be comfortable. But when they were so close, it was inevitable that he felt uneasy. Sorry for not going out to meet you. Teacher Shifai, who was in charge of welcoming guests in front of the door, came up and saluted respectfully. He took a deep look at Huaisher and the two people behind him. Are these two your disciples? Yes, don't you know them? Huaisher didn't understand. He made way for him and introduced them. The older one is called Little Hut in the Woods, and the younger one is called Yuan. They're both among the top participants in this knife hunt. You should know them. I've heard of them. Teacher Shifai's expression twitched. He glanced at Little Hut in the Woods and said in a deep voice, "They're indeed young talents." If he didn't stare so hard when he spoke, it would be more convincing. Isn't it? Huaisher patted Little Hut in the Woods' shoulder vigorously, as if he was afraid that others didn't know. My two disciples are good at everything, but they're a little low-key. They don't usually show their faces in public, and are a little afraid of strangers. I hope that everyone can interact with them more and make them more cheerful. There was a crunch. Someone's teeth were crushed from clenching too hard.
But when Huaisher looked over, everyone's expression was the same as usual. They lowered their eyes respectfully and didn't dare to look directly at him. I will. Teacher Shafai lowered his head and promised. Sir Huaisher, please come in. All right, don't stand at the door. You're delaying them from entertaining the guests. After Huaisher had drawn enough hatred for his two students, he clapped his hands and swaggered inside. As he walked, he turned back and lectured little 19 behind him. See, people who stay at home for too long don't have a bright mind. It's easy for them to become stupid. Don't always stay at home and play games. Go out more often, make more friends, get to know more rulers and elements of destruction, and see more of the world. Lin 19's expression also twitched. He nodded stiffly, feeling those gazes on his back. He was originally a little anxious, but after hearing his teacher's words, he couldn't help but laugh. Then those gazes on him became more and more gloomy. When Huaisher walked into the banquet hall, he separated from his two students and was directly invited to the front. There was actually an old acquaintance there, an old man who didn't care about the rules of the banquet and had already started to drink and eat meat. He was so happy that his eyes were drowsy. His skinny face was red, and his nose was so long that it was a little scary. But he was wearing a luxurious robe that was comparable to that of a noble official. He also had a cultivation crown on his head. He frequently asked for wine and meat to be served. The disciple serving him didn't dare to show any anger or unhappiness. Instead, he eagerly ran around for him. Oh, isn't this little brother Huaisher? The old man raised his eyes and looked over. Then he beamed with joy. It's really been a long time. Recently, I've heard about the great things you've done. It really makes my generation proud. You're too kind. I'm just taking advantage of the situation. Huaisher nodded politely. He sat down and replied politely, I'm the one who has troubled Dai Tengu to take care of me. His previous casual and arrogant attitude was swept away. He was now serious. This was the ruler of Dai Tengu Mountain, the leader of a large group in Yingzhou. At the same time, he was also one of the elders of the Cooking Demon Competition's organizing committee. He was also famous in the world, the Dai Tengu, relying on the Dragon Mountain Square to eat and freeload so many benefits from Dai Tengu Mountain. Huaisher naturally had to be more polite. Otherwise, what would he do if he couldn't freeload in the future? Ah, it's just a small matter. Could it be that my generation has done something that deserves your special thanks? The old man grinned. On the other hand, little brother Huaisher has surprised me even more. At that time, I didn't let the Dragon Mountain Square forcefully pull you into Dai Tengu Mountain. What a pity, what a pity. As he spoke, he laughed loudly and raised his wine cup. Drink, drink, drink. Since we've met, then bring me along. Huaisher smiled and raised his wine cup. Just nice, I can freeload some good wine. Thus, there was one more person drinking. In any case, since it was free wine, it would be a waste if he didn't drink. Huaisher wasn't in the mood to sit obediently and wait for the banquet to start. It was already troublesome enough for him to be the tool of these two old men, who knew what medicine they were planning to sell in their gourds. In any case, you guys can do whatever you want. It's fine as long as you don't look for me for the rest of the matters. Aya, aren't the two of them little brother Huaisher's students? Dai Tengu held his wine cup and glanced at the people below. They are very similar to you. MH? Huaisher shook his head. It's not a compliment that they are similar to me. I only hope that they can achieve something and not be like me, always causing trouble. Since ancient times, how can there be anyone who can achieve something without causing trouble? Dai Tengu laughed. If they only know how to cause trouble, they are nothing more than troublemakers.
The key is that they can achieve something. In that case, what do you think of my two students? Huaishir asked. That's hard to say. Daitenga scratched his chin and grinned. From my perspective, one of them can inherit your legacy, while the other can open up new horizons. Both of them are rare geniuses. Huaishir shook his head. Daitengu, you are too focused on praising them. You didn't tell me who you are referring to. That would depend on your plans. Daitengu glanced over. If the teacher is you, what do you plan to do? That would be a little awkward. Huaishir laughed. Their lives are their own things. As a teacher, it's already not bad if I can guide them on their path. I've never thought of making any arrangements for them. If I really have to say what I'm looking forward to, I just hope that when they commit a crime in the future, they won't say that I'm the one who taught them. Daitenga started. After that, he laughed uproariously. You are also someone who doesn't mean what you say. Come, let's drink. Let's drink. Huaishir lifted his cup and smiled as he stared at the commotion below. Before the banquet started, the dishes were already served. Chapter 8:17. In the strange atmosphere of the banquet, in Yingzhou, Yuan sat upright, holding the teacup and looking down calmly, as if she didn't notice the indifferent eyes around her at all. She just looked back at her side from time to time. Puzzled, why are you sliding down? Woodland Hut, who was slowly wriggling down on the tatami chair, raised his head and smiled stiffly. I'm just relaxing. Relaxing under the table? It's cool down there. Woodland Hut's expression stiffened, and then he shrank down a little. Yuan seemed to be aware of it. She raised her eyes and looked at the curtain high in the distance. She immediately understood the situation when she sensed the indistinct gaze from behind the curtain. You know him? To be honest, I've only seen him once. Yuan understood more and more. Victim? Woodland Hut's eyes twitched for a long time, and then he nodded with difficulty. Almost. Then you deserve it. Yuan had seen too many cases of Jiang Yashuang being blocked at the door and chopped at the door after he was exposed. Solve it yourself. If only I could solve it. Woodland Hut wanted to say something, but stopped. He couldn't help sighing to the sky, and then he took out his mobile phone from his pocket to play games. The middle-aged man behind the opposite table finally couldn't stand it anymore. He slapped the table angrily and stared at him. How dare you come here, thief? For a moment, almost everyone's eyes were looking at him. He was glowing with excitement. Here it comes, the personal disciple of Professor. Sato finally got angry. Why are you shouting so loudly? Woodland Hut's hand shook because of the shouting. He made a mistake in the game, so he gave up decisively. He immediately rolled his eyes and asked back, Friend, please mind your words, okay? I'm a guest invited by the Sword Sage. Why can't I come? What's wrong? Did you just find that you don't allow people under the age of 18 to drink in Yingzhou? Why are you in such a hurry to call 110 or to write a complaint letter? As soon as he said this, everyone was stunned. Then they realized that it seemed that maybe the Taoist hall really didn't notice this. Even Iguchi, who was angry, was stunned for a long time. Interrupted by him, he forgot most of the reproach that had been brewing in his stomach for a long time. He immediately became angrier and asked in a cold voice, Guest, everyone here tonight is a qualified sword-hunting warrior, but where did you get your sword from? Do you dare to say it? Why wouldn't I dare? Little Hut in the woods picked his nose and calmly replied, It's strange. Yesterday, when I was walking by the river, I happened to meet a person who climbed out of the river. That guy looked like a rat and didn't look like a good person, so I went up and asked the same question as you. The little hut in the woods poked its head out and imitated him perfectly. Where did you get your saber? And guess what? That guy tried to run away, but I killed him in the end. He ran too fast, and even his corpse fell into the river. We can't find it anymore." He picked up his teacup and sighed. Heavenly materials and earthly treasures belong to those who are virtuous. It's probably because that little thief's virtue doesn't match his position. Silence. A stunned silence. Everyone was stupefied and looked over in shock. They had never seen such a shameless person before. For a moment, he was speechless. Only the hut in the forest, accompanied by hot tea, enjoyed the increasingly strong resentment, and finally felt comfortable. That's the taste. With a low cracking sound, a crack appeared on the table in front of Iguchi. The middle-aged man's face was livid, and he could no longer restrain the rage in his heart. A cold light flashed in his eyes as he said, "What's the use of flaunting your mouth? You swindler, do you dare to fight with my subordinate?" "Of course I don't dare." Little Hut in the Woods responded with a trembling voice. He replied shamelessly, "If I knew that you sent an invitation here to beat me up, I wouldn't have come." The young man raised his head and glanced at the man in front of him with disdain. The mobile phone in his hand spun, and every time it spun, the blood vessels on Iguchi's forehead jumped wildly. If he had to say, these guys had been practicing swordsmanship every day until their brains were fried. If they directly pulled out their swords and slashed at him, he might be a little afraid. But if it was a quarrel, then he wouldn't be sleepy if he brought his junior brother along. How could a gold medal bar spirit, who was banned on average 6 times a month, be afraid of this? As for beating people up, then come at me. Come, hit me here. At that time, Little Hut in the Woods would not only not resist, but also help you record it. He had thought of the titles. There were 2 shocking, one quick turn, and one, if you don't watch it, I'll delete it. It was guaranteed that tomorrow they would be popular all over Ingzhou and go to the world. Just opposite. Iguchi's face turned from livid to red. He was already furious. He was about to attack and pull out his sword, but his expression stiffened. His movements stopped abruptly. It was as if he had seen a ghost. He looked behind Little Hut in the Woods in shock, as if he couldn't believe it. His eyes widened, and his chin almost fell to the ground. How old was he? He still played this trick to coax a child. Little Hut in the Woods sneered. He had stopped using this trick when he was 8 years old. Just as he was about to ridicule him, he suddenly realized that something was wrong, because more and more people were looking behind him, including Yuan next to him. But in his perception, there was no one behind him. Only a faint smell of perfume came faintly in the breeze. The tatami slightly trembled, and the person behind him bent down and sat down, curiously looking at his face. She smiled. She said, "We meet again, Mr. Yamanaka." Little Hut in the Woods' expression stiffened, and he slowly turned his head, looking at the girl in the robe, and her curious look. The corners of his eyes twitched wildly. He was like a kitten that had been targeted by a predator. He froze in place. "Huh?" The person asked in confusion, "Why don't you speak?" "Sorry, my surname is Lin." He coughed and tried to move to the side a little, wanting to ask for help. But Yuan showed a look of watching a show and picked up the teacup instead. Little Hut in the Woods was numb, and he could only force a smile. "You might have mistaken me for someone else." "Really?" The girl seemed to be puzzled. She raised her hand and pointed at the packaging in his pocket. "But the cigarette box is exactly the same." This Little Hut in the Woods expression stiffened, and he was sweating. Only then did he realize that the box in his pocket was still the same one from yesterday. "Ahem, this proves that your country's piece is very popular. The smell hasn't changed, but your expression is different from yesterday's high-spirited look." The girl looked at his appearance with a faint smile. "But then again, I helped you out. Shouldn't you thank me?" "Then I thank you." Little Hut in the Woods squeezed out a smile with difficulty. Is there anything else? So, the girl's smile became more and more cheerful. Well, nothing goodbye, she thought for a moment, and suddenly stood up. Little Hut in the Woods fell into a daze. He was prepared to counter every move that came his way, but when his opponent suddenly turned around and left, it made him feel a sense of defeat, as if he had no moves to counter with "Goodbye, Mr. Yamanaka," under the bridge. The girl looked back and smiled, saying goodbye softly. It's not bad to look at you from the front. Let's play together next time. Just like that, she turned around and went back behind the curtain. Little Hut in the Woods looked back until his neck couldn't bear the burden. In the long silence, he seemed to finally react, slowly turning his head and looking at those complicated expressions. Who is she? So those gazes became more and more gloomy. Damn it, that idiot Iguchi. In the seats above, Yace Ijing, a normal student, couldn't help but curse in his heart. That idiot patted his chest and promised with a solemn expression, but when a wild girl stood up and showed her face, he immediately revealed his true colors. Feeling the cold gaze from the top, his expression stiffened, and then he angrily clenched his fists under the table. The second young master was about to lose his patience. No matter what, he had to pay back for the accident that happened at the previous knife hunt. Otherwise, the second young master, who presided over the knife hunt, this time would lose his authority. If he was disrespectful in the competition for the position of the next dojo master, it wouldn't end well for those who took sides early. Thinking of this, he couldn't help but sigh. In the end, he was too impatient. He should have waited, just waited. Unfortunately, the situation was beyond his control. The moment he made up his mind, he suddenly raised his hand and clapped his hands. A crisp sound filled with killing intent spread out, instantly causing countless noises to dissipate. Even the geisha dancing in the distance froze in place. For a moment, he attracted everyone's attention. Too weak, such a girl's attitude is really unbearable to look at. Yace coldly glanced at the performance above and said with dissatisfaction, "It's because of these weak songs and dances that their minds are being worn down. Each session is worse than the previous one." "Hey, Yace, you're going too far." His colleague, who was watching, happily looked over. Although he didn't understand what was going on, he still tried to smooth things over. Using cultural relics together is the way to improve. The children have worked so hard for so long, drinking some wine to relax is not a big deal. They'll be fine after practicing more tomorrow. Yace coldly snorted, "Have you forgotten the teachings of the sword sage?" As he spoke, he raised his hand and pointed at the hanging scroll hanging at the top, where the words "permanent battle formation" were written in thick ink. That was the handwriting of the sword sage in his spare time. The original meaning was that the samurai must be prepared at all times to rush to the battlefield, so they must be diligent and must not relax at all. Since everyone wants to watch the performance, why don't I perform for everyone? Yace slowly stood up and removed the cumbersome haori on his body. He took out a rope from his sleeves and tied the sleeves around his body. After that, he pressed on the long sword at his waist and stood in the middle of the hall. He spoke in a lofty manner. "Where is there a performance more suitable for a samurai than a sword duel?" "Oi, Yace, enough is enough." "Shut up, Sato. It's precisely because there are people like you who are blinded by love that the dojo suffered such great humiliation." Yace glared at him, causing Sato to want to say something, but hesitated. In the end, he had nothing to say and could only cover his face with his sleeves and leave in grief. For a moment, that indignant and unyielding aura caused countless disciples to cheer. "Oh, yeah, the situation doesn't seem good. Little brother, why sure." In this silence, the drunken Daitengu slapped his knees and laughed loudly. "See, trouble has come knocking on our door. You don't care?" Huaisher bitterly smiled. I've been toasting quite a few times during this half a day. Ahahaha, I'm a Daitengu. I've never complained about liveliness. I'm drunk and need liveliness to accompany my wine. Daitengu grinned. Also, this is the dojo. My old face isn't worth much. Huaisher sighed. After that, he sensed Yesa's gaze on him. The samurai stood upright and glared at Huaisher. Sir Huaisher, please guide me. The experts in the dojo are as common as clouds. Why do you need me, a classical music teacher, to guide you? Huaisher shrugged. Could it be that you also wish to learn the cello? Yase widened his eyes and asked, In that case, sir, you don't dare to? I'm still injured. Forgive me for not being able to accompany you. Huaisher's words caused Yase to start, but he couldn't help but heave a sigh of relief in his heart. Originally, he was prepared to pay the price to cause a huge ruckus. He didn't expect that he would be able to force the Danbo king to take a step back so easily. But after that, Huaisher picked up Daitenga's wine flask and lowered his head to pour wine. Also, I'm embarrassed to bully a junior. When he spoke, he ignored the fact that Daitengu was already over 40 years old. His tone was solemn, but what was unexpected was that even the others didn't feel that there was anything wrong. Then he continued, Since you insist on asking for guidance, then I'll let my most useless disciple have a go at you. After speaking, Huaisher raised his eyes and looked down. At that instant, the legs of the little house in the forest started to twitch crazily. He subconsciously wanted to hide under the table, but it was already too late. Come up, little 19. Huaisher smiled as he instructed. His eyes were filled with anticipation. He was like a trainer who threw a poke ball. He was incomparably happy. Use drummer on him, Pikachu. Chapter 818. F********. Why is it me? At this moment, under the gazes of everyone, Woodland Hut's vision turned black as tears flowed down his cheeks. Why am I always the unlucky one? Also, why am I always the most disappointing one? Seeing Yuan beside him smiling so widely, Woodland Hut trembled from anger. How should I live as a tool to make my teacher satisfied? But even though he was angry, even though he was trembling, since his teacher had spoken, he didn't dare to leave. He could only brace himself and walk forward step by step, feeling the gazes of the people around him. It was difficult for him to move. He stiffly squeezed out a smile. At this moment, he finally recalled the words Huaisher had said when he came here. Go openly and leave in a grand manner. Now that he was finally about to leave, he discovered that he was actually so grand. Indeed, his departure wasn't too peaceful. Seeing how guilty he was, a series of boos rang out from the surroundings. Just by looking at his posture, one could tell that his martial arts were sloppy. How could he compete with the teachers of the dojo? Huaisher acted like he didn't hear anything. He waved his hand, indicating for Woodland Hut to come over. How is it? He smiled and encouraged. Are you confident? Woodland Hut did his best to squeeze out a smile that was no better than crying. Teacher, I didn't bring my sword out today. He did his best to wink, indicating for Huaisher to quickly take out one from his treasured sword to save his dog life. In the end, before Huaisher could reply, Daitengu, who was watching the show at the side, raised his hand. Then use this old man's sword. As he spoke, he casually pulled it out. It was like plucking a feather. An insignificant sword was pulled out from Daitenga's wings that were hidden in the air. But now he could only cry. The pitch-black sword was heavy in his hand. Would he be able to live long enough to continue his edge was his studies? No matter how one looked at it, no way they could beat him. It was a treasured sword. It would be more appropriate to come by. If it was nurtured by a skilled warrior for a few years to a teacher, any alchemist would be able to infuse it into a why would he go to the door and cause trouble? It would become an ancient treasure. Drink this bowl of wine. I'll give it to you and go. Daitengu casually
picked
tossed
up
a
the
wine bowl in front of him
aren't you thanking
and
Senior?
handed it to him.
Don't be nervous.
Has a helpless
Just
look
perform
on his
as you
face.
should.
It was like he was a
This wasn't the
parent who
college
saw his
entrance
child
exam.
being insensible.
What kind of standard
and
did he have to
receiving
perform
red
as he
packets
should?
from others?
Little Hut in the
I-
Woods gritted his
I
teeth.
have to thank you.
He picked up the large
The cabin
wine
in the
bowl
woods was
in front
so
of him
angry
and down
that it almost
he wanted
burst
to
into
smash
tears.
it. But after thinking for a while,
It's not worth mentioning.
he still carefully
If you
placed
have
it back
time,
on the table.
just come and help out
Huaisha
at the head
patted his
chef
shoulder
of Heavenly
and
Dog
smiled
Mountain.
meaningfully.
Daitengu
He
smiled
asked,
warmly.
"Are you ready?"
I'm still lacking
Little Hut
a
in the
worker
woods
to
felt
pound
his blood
rice,
and
little
chi
brother,
churning as his face
Huaisha,
turned red. You wouldn't
he
have
was
any
actually
objections,
unable
right?
to withstand the
It should be
effects
his
of the
honor
wine.
to be recognized
But shortly
by Senior.
after,
Waves
Huaisha
of heat
smiled
rose from his body
and nodded.
In the past,
So
if he
hot.
heard that he could
It was
go
as
to
though
the
he had
Heavenly
been
Dog Mountain
ignited
for free to
in a
cultivate the
daze.
culinary
He
arts.
suddenly discovered
Little Hut in
that
the
he
Woods
seemed to have
might have
entered a
laughed out
state
loud.
of transcendence as the origin substance rose. Boundless, baleful aura and ferocious intent appeared from that face that was used to having a harmless smile on his face. The Shung in the shadows transformed into a projection. He broke free from the restraints and revealed his malevolent shadow. A cold gaze swept past Little Hut in the Woods. The pure evil thoughts that had been purified countless times spread out like a raging torrent, causing the bustling banquet hall to stagnate for a moment. At this moment, far away in the present realm, the scarlet eyes of countless crows dropped down from the sky of the Dombwa district. They looked down from afar and cast a large group of blessings from hell. It caused his eyes to turn silver white, like boiling steel, glowing with a blazing light. It was difficult to hide his violent nature. From top to bottom, looking down tyrannically, it caused an indescribable chill and fear to rise in the hearts of countless people. In an instant, there was a deathly silence. The corner of Yo's eyes twitched. He seemed to have finally remembered. This shameless and obscene brat looked cunning, but in essence, he was completely different from those who bullied the weak and feared the strong. That was just a character design. It was just a rule in tabletop role-playing games. He was one of the future inheritors of the holy name of the Illuminator, an evil son born with noble blood, a freak that couldn't be restrained or measured by morality. The praise and condemnation of the world meant nothing to him. As long as this evil karma continued to sublimate, he would always be an evil eater, one of the symbols of hell. Now, Little Hut in the Woods held his sword, smiled at Huaisha, and answered his question. "I'm ready, Sensei." "Then go." Huaisha nodded with gratification. "You don't have to stand behind me. You can stand in front of everyone." "Yes." The youth nodded. When he looked back, his smile slowly dissipated, and he walked step by step towards his opponent in front of him. He said to Yos, "Please enlighten me." After a moment of shock, Yos once again returned to calmness and seriousness. As a human executioner who once roamed the borders, how could he be fooled by this appearance? That evil power was indeed so quiet and pure that it was frightening. He didn't know how much evil and demonic energy was used to extract such an essence. But even if he could barely stand shoulder to shoulder with him, there was still a decisive gap between the two sides. The strength of the power was important, but the skill to use this power was the key factor that really determined the result. After hundreds of battles, thousands of battles, after a long time of tempering, the sword skill that had been refined to perfection was born for this moment. Such an unsightly posture, as long as he could break it in the blink of an eye, and then drive straight in, wrists, abdomen, heart, throat, and even head, all the vital points would be exposed. It was simply a matter of being trampled on. This might be better. As long as he made this arrogant brat pay the price here, then the second young master's authority would be restored. He was just protecting the dignity of the dojo, and no one could criticize him. Even if the dojo and Dombwa went to war because of this, it could further increase the power of his side. At that moment, an ominous glint appeared in his eyes, and the killing intent that had been accumulating for many years at the border burst out as he pulled out his sword. But at that moment, a shrill cry burst out in his ears. Yos opened his eyes wide in shock, but found that his opponent didn't guard carefully and relied on a completely flawed posture to launch a strong attack on him. Just like his sensei at this moment, he used the simplest and most straightforward way of attack. Step Tangju. The sinister darkness of the path of evil converged on the tip of his sword, causing the light above his head to flicker. This was because the darkness had engulfed him like a surging tide. Rather than calling it a sword technique, it was more accurate to call it a curse that was attached to the blade. But to block this kind of attack, he didn't even need to retreat. All he needed to do was intertwine, block, deflect, and attack in the blink of an eye to determine victory or defeat. He had brought this upon himself. Boom! At that moment, the two swords collided. Yos fell into a daze. An illusory sound echoed in his ears as if the heavens and earth were trembling. The sky was spinning, and the earth was trembling. Everything around him seemed to echo, and the entire world seemed to be singing loudly from within his body. This was just an illusion. However, his consciousness suddenly stopped for a moment that didn't make any sense. This was because as the swords collided, the countless vibrations and curses began to flow together, using the swords as a bridge and pouring into his body. The cabin's origin substance vibrated, his heart beat, and even his blood vessels pulsed. After combining the essence of evil and the venomous curse, they all converged into a single line. It easily broke through all of his defenses, spreading from the sword hilt to his fingers and wrist before spreading to his entire body. An explosion. His vision went black. It was as if he had fallen into a trance for a moment. He closed his eyes, then opened them again. Everything in front of him was completely different. Amidst the darkness, he was still standing in his original position. Across from him, the cabin had already sheathed his sword and returned to his original position. He stared at Yos with a smile that wasn't a smile. He moved his fingers. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. In the instant that all 5 of his fingers were retracted, a crisp, cracking sound could be heard. It was so close that it almost seemed like an illusion. What's going on? Yo's eyes widened as he asked angrily, "You're looking down on me?" His cracked face slowly contorted as black blood seeped out from his 7 apertures. As he spoke, he coughed violently, and viscous blood gushed out from his ruptured lungs. The last thing he saw was the man sitting behind the cabin. He lifted the wine cup on the table, raised it with a smile, and drained it in a single gulp. This was how they bid farewell. And then the earth and darkness rushed towards him. Amidst the deathly silence, not a single sound could be heard. Only Yos, who had fainted and convulsed on the ground, was slowly seeping out blood from his body. He wasn't even a match for his opponent. Soon, applause filled the air. Not bad at all. Ha 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 ha, this is truly an eye-opener. Tengu raised his hands and laughed mockingly, ignoring the expressions of everyone present. I didn't expect to be able to witness such a pleasant surprise today. This is truly delightful. Kamikaze, how do you feel? Time changes, and everything changes. The old man standing in front of the door replied, "The new generation naturally surpasses the old generation. This is very good." The old man, known as the Sword Saint, waved his hand calmly, gesturing for his subordinates to lift Yos from the ground and send him for treatment. He walked forward calmly, but Huaisher couldn't help but feel an indescribable illusion. It was so subtle, but it was also so discordant. Qin Yi subconsciously tensed up. This was because he couldn't hear the old man's voice at all. To be more precise, he couldn't sense the old man's heartbeat, pulse, or even origin energy fluctuations. It was as though he didn't exist in this place. No, it should be said that he wasn't here in the first place. But what exactly did he see? What did everyone else see? Was it an illusion? Or, at that moment, the old man who passed by the hut in the forest patted the young man's shoulder and glanced at Huaishur with a faint smile. He didn't expose Qin Ye's trick. Instead, he nodded slightly. In Huaishur's eyes, Sword Saint Kamikaze's body suddenly turned blurry, and then condensed again. His heartbeat, pulse, and origin energy fluctuations appeared. It became more and more real, and it also revealed the essence of illusion. Huaishur was sweating profusely. He finally understood. He was here, or he felt that he should be here. And so, everyone saw him here. This was a supreme tear that he couldn't imagine. Chapter 819. Huaishur couldn't be sure if what he saw was real or an illusion, because to Sword Saint Kamikaze, reality or illusion was no longer important. What was truly important was the willpower that changed the situation. If he believed that he was here, then he would be here. Everyone would be able to see him. If he believed that he had drawn his sword, then everyone would be able to see him drawing his sword. If he believed that the enemy he killed would die, then his enemy was already dead. It was precisely this absolute confidence in himself that created this unbelievable supreme realm. Right now, with the arrival of Kamikaze, the originally gloomy atmosphere in the dojo instantly changed. Everyone's eyes were filled with fervor. It was as though they were glowing with faith. This was the peak that countless samurai worshipped day and night, the peak that they chased after. Right now, he sat behind his seat and smiled as he raised his cup, greeting his friend beside him. "Daitengu, how have you been?" Daitengu grinned. "I'm still far from death." Kamikaze smiled. "I originally thought that you were too lazy to come." Daitengu shook his head indifferently. "How can I not go to a place where there's wine? Then I'll have to trouble you." Kamikaze nodded. I don't remember promising anything. Datenga laughed strangely, but he still raised his cup and drank with Kamikaze. Right after that, the old man's gaze turned to Huai Shi. How is Mr. Russell? He eats well and sleeps well. His body is healthy. Huai Shi replied, I originally thought that Sword Saint Kamikaze would ask about someone else. Ha! Isn't that guy still alive and kicking? What's there to be concerned about? The old man also raised his cup and toasted. After toasting with Huai Shi, the old man then greeted all the honored guests who came today. There was no need for him to do anything else. Just by being here, he was already a stabilizing force, bestowing boundless confidence and joy to the disciples of the dojo. The banquet began. The singing and dancing continued. There were no more accidents. The banquet continued in an orderly manner until it reached the end. When the servants cleared away the cups and plates and served the refreshments, the banquet finally came to an end. However, everyone's gaze towards the top became more and more expectant. He hoped to receive guidance from the Sword Saint to gain the favor of that old man and to receive guidance from the peak, even if it was just a glance. I think everyone can't wait anymore, right? Sword Saint Shangchuan smiled and put down his teacup. I'm ashamed of myself. As the owner of the dojo, I'm used to living in seclusion. The only time I teach is at the banquet held once every 4 years. It's really shameful. Time is precious, so let's get started. He paused and then said seriously and warmly, this is the last lesson I can give you as the Sword Saint. Here, I have a question. The old man opened his mouth and asked, everyone here is a warrior who has gone through hundreds of battles, a courageous hero, and a wise man who is quick-witted. Then, among you, can anyone answer my question? He asked, the people here must be like me. They're all Tao seekers who want to reach the peak and challenge themselves. They're all Tao seekers who want to become powerful at all costs. But what I'm curious about is what kind of power can be considered the strongest? As soon as he said this, everyone fell into a daze and froze in place. It was hard to understand. The Honorable Sword Saint, who was known as the strongest in Yingzhou, no, maybe even in the present realm, would ask such a question. But Shangchuan still smiled and drank his tea, quietly waiting for his disciples to come to a conclusion. After a quarter of an hour, he put down his teacup and looked down at his last disciple. Jiu Chuan, have you thought it through? Master, I'm not smart. The young man with glasses nodded and answered respectfully, in my heart, a power like Master is the strongest. Shangchuan shook his head and smiled. Isn't there someone who's better than me? Aren't the 7 natural enemies the true peak of the world? That's not what I'm looking for. Jiu Chuan answered flatly, the only peak I want is Master. Then go back and practice. About 80 years? If you're fast, 60 years. Shangchuan shook his head and sighed. Then think about the Sword Saint of Yingzhou. Those words were not a reprimand, nor were they disappointment. It was just a result he already knew. Not only was Jiu Chuan not disappointed, he was ecstatic. He was so excited that his hands were trembling. Yes, he bowed respectfully, and the people around couldn't help but look at him with envy and jealousy. A warrior who was appointed by the Sword Saint, who could become the Sword Saint of Yingzhou in 80 years. A person's life might not have 80 years, but in the whole world, how many Sword Saints were there? Then, Zhongju, what about you? The Sword Saint probed. The middle-aged man shook his head and smiled bitterly. I'm like Jiu Chuan, but you're different from Jiu Chuan. What he envies is my swordsmanship, but what you desire is my power. Shangchuan said bluntly, but my power isn't the strongest. Zhongju, you've taken the wrong path. You're right, Master. Zhongju nodded calmly, as if ashamed. By the time I understand this, it's already too late. It doesn't matter. It's especially late to mend the pen after the sheep is lost. Shangchuan comforted him. Go to the imperial palace tomorrow and ask for an official position. The High Emperor is in need of people, so he won't treat you badly. He also hopes that you can be loyal and serve the High Emperor. Zhongju was stunned. He was both happy and sad. After a long time, he bowed respectfully. Thank you for your magnanimity. Then, Master, with two unworthy disciples taking the lead, the others can also speak freely, right? Shangchuan followed up with another question. She casually pointed at a disciple. In your opinion, what should be the strongest power? That disciple was stunned. He hesitated and finally asked tentatively, those who obey me live, and those who oppose me die? Ha ha ha, that's not bad. Shangchuan rubbed her knees and laughed. Then you shouldn't have come to the dojo. Instead, you should have gone to the astronomy meeting. If you went to protect Zarathustra, the whole realm would be nothing but a small plaything to you. As she said this, the old man waved his hand, indicating that he didn't need to be ashamed. She asked another person. The student bowed his head and answered solemnly, this disciple believes that unrestrained freedom is true power. Then you might be in a lot of pain, unbreakable lord. Shangchuan said sympathetically, the power you desire does not exist in the present realm. I'm afraid that you can only break free from your shackles by going to the border and hell, right? Perhaps one day you will go to the tomb of the unreturnable, abandon all of this, and go to hell to seek relief. As she said this, she looked at Yuan. Little girl, you are the top of the knife hunter list. In your knowledge, what kind of power is called the strongest? I don't know. Yuan answered frankly. There are too many powerful people in this world. Even my great-grandfather can't be the strongest. But in my opinion, the strongest power should be something that can bring hope to the suffering. Then you should learn more from your teacher. Shangchuan looked at Huai Shi with a faint smile, and then looked at the little house in the forest. Then, what about this brave young man? The little house in the forest bowed respectfully and gave a standard answer. His peace is darkness, his sight is light. He does not eat or sleep. Wind and rain are. This was the decisive judgment that every Lin family member would make. The peak of the path of sin, the candle dragon. Ha 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 ha. Regardless of whether it is true or not, you are still a cunning fellow. Shangchuan shook her head and laughed. But being so lonely, won't you feel lonely? The little house in the forest lowered his head and did not reply. Think again, young man. Shangchuan said, think again. You have a long life ahead of you. It is enough for you to find the answer you want. This time, the little house in the forest did not remain silent. He suddenly raised his head and asked loudly, what if there is no answer? Then you can turn yourself into the answer. Shangchuan said, if you want to walk the path that no one has taken, then you will be the beacon for your successor. You shouldn't be afraid. Instead, you should be happy. The young man was stunned. Shangchuan retracted her gaze and looked to the side. Hey, it is fine that you are teaching your disciple, but why are you looking at me? Daitenga scratched its red nose, feeling helpless. Shangchuan said, since you are already here, why are you so stingy? Daitenga sighed. From my point of view, being able to drink an endless amount of good wine, eat an endless amount of delicacies, and watch an endless amount of excitement is the most beautiful and strongest strength in the world. If I say this out loud, the juniors will laugh at me. Ahahaha, those who are content will be happy. Why are you ashamed? Shangchuan clapped her hands and laughed. In the end, she turned her gaze to Huai Shi. Huai Shi helplessly placed his wine cup down. In that case, Huai Shi Kun, can you give me an answer? Shangchuan asked. For someone like you, even after obtaining such achievements, you are still unable to satisfy your thirst. What is the strength you are chasing after? It isn't something that is too far away. Mr. Shangchuan, there is no need for outsiders to tell you. It isn't worth mentioning. Huaisha shrugged and laughed self-mockingly. There is no need for me to embarrass myself. At the very most, it was just living a happy life. Such an ordinary wish was not worth mentioning when compared to those grand ambitions. Shangchuan nodded and didn't force him. She continued to ask. At the start, some people had a puzzled look on their faces. But as time passed, they all sank into contemplation. At the end, their expressions turned heavy as they lowered their eyes. They listened respectfully. The reason I am here today isn't because I want to hold a meeting to share my wishes. I also don't want to seek an answer that is destined to have no result. Shangchuan paused for a moment and spoke in a heavy voice. I believe that everyone has already obtained the answer you want from the many answers. The strongest strength in the world. From the very start, this was a false proposition. It was an unreachable illusion, a mirage that was so far away that it couldn't be chased. It was just that it looked very beautiful. Chapter 8:20. For 130 years, the Sword Saint had been invincible in Japan. Could such a force be considered the strongest? But why was there a barbarian general who dominated the world? The general was so strong, but he was still imprisoned in this island country by the American lineage. Was the American lineage strong? It controlled 1/3 of the border through finance and economy, monopolizing the development of countless infernal realms. It was indeed a colossus that ordinary people could not hope to reach. However, it was publicly acknowledged that the American lineage was the weakest among the 6 lineages. So, which lineage was the strongest? Rome, Egypt, East Summer? Could the strongest in East Summer, Fu Sangguang, do whatever he wanted? There were still weapon grandmasters above. But didn't weapon grandmasters still have to obey Blackbird? The East Summer lineage was so powerful, but it was essentially an extension of East Summer. So, was East Summer the strongest? But it was only one of the 5 permanents. The 5 permanents were so powerful, but they were still unable to maintain the operation of this world. They still needed the Astronomy Association to mend and mobilize. Under the suppression of the 3 Great Seals, the maintenance of the present realm operated as usual. However, the Astronomy Association still had the fall of the utopia. The general administration could not stop itself from becoming bloated. The continuation court was also enduring the pressure of the rising degree of distortion day after day, painstakingly working day and night to correct it. As for the Golden Dawn, it was still expanding its influence in infernal realm, not to mention the existences in the silent zone in the depths of infernal realm, and the elements of destruction that could overturn the present realm. If the power that could cause death was called the strongest, then the strongest power was in infernal realm. But was such power valuable in the present realm? It was meaningless to be obsessed with power itself. All one could obtain was a string of boring numbers that kept expanding. Power was valuable, but what was truly important was the purpose of using this power. Otherwise, what was the difference between an ascendant and a bank account that had a fixed deposit before death? In the past, every disciple who graduated from a swordsmanship dojo would diligently cultivate the path of the samurai and the sage's poetry. But in the end, it was just to cultivate more loyal subordinates and lackeys. The Sword Saint said calmly. The Sword Saint said faintly, the disciples seek power in order to find a way to advance and become a warrior. The officials also gain loyal and reliable subordinates. Putting aside morality from the point of view of benefits, this is generally the case. It was also because of this that he was given the bad name of breaking the law with martial arts. A warrior must be a tool, a sword, or a lackey, such a saying had spread far and wide, and many people even thought so. Even tools have their own desires. Even swords have their own thoughts. I sincerely hope that you can be different. The Sword Saint said, "Times have changed. Everyone, you still have a choice." When he said this, he didn't conceal the vicissitudes and decay on his body in the slightest, but his eyes became even sharper, as if he wanted to carve his words into the souls of his disciples. You still have a choice. If he didn't want to become a mere tool, then he had to make a choice. I'm sure everyone already knows about the guests I've invited today. In the silence, Shang Chuan slowly told them, "Here, some people come from the looming hall, representing the supreme power of Yingzhou. Some come from the Astronomical Association, representing the order of the present realm that can't be disobeyed. Some come from the border, unrestrained and carefree. And there are also guests from the Tomb of the Returnless, who have established their authority in hell. If there is anything in this land that can be called the strongest power, it is undoubtedly what they represent. They are all far better than me, an old man. Their achievements are far better than mine. What you want, you can seek from their path. Today is your last lesson. You have already learned the basics of swordsmanship. As a teacher, there is no need for me to guide you. In such a short time, I don't have any secret techniques to teach you. So, I can only help you open the door to the future." Sword Saint Shang Chuan raised his eyes and stared at the group of graduated disciples. "Now, you already have something that can make you stronger. You have to walk the road in the future by yourself. It's up to you to decide where to use your strength." So, full of expectation and hope, he softly taught them, "It doesn't matter if you commit crimes or uphold the right path. I just hope that you can be satisfied and have some enlightenment when facing death." Shang Quan said, "As your teacher, this is the only hope I have for you." In the solemn silence, all the disciples slowly stood up and bowed to the old man in front of them. They offered their pure gratitude to their teacher. This was the last lesson of the Sword Saint, to guide the future. During the banquet, Huai Shi shook his head in self-mockery. He didn't expect that the Sword Saint sent him an invitation just to use him as a teaching case. At the same time, he witnessed the sincerity of the Sword Saint. If there were disciples of dojos who came to the Danbua inner circle to seek a position in the future, how could he not consider it? In addition to himself, there were people from the Yingzhou governing authority, Looming Hall, Heavenly Dog Mountain, Tomb of the Returnless, and even the agents of other business giants. This wave was directly a large-scale talent recruitment market. Teacher took the lead and helped them organize a high-end party to let them see the big shots. If they knew what was good for them, these disciples who had obtained the qualification to graduate from the dojos would probably directly start to hug his thigh and hand over their resumes after the banquet. At the same time, he also suppressed the impetuous atmosphere of bravery and ruthlessness. With his authority, he forced the disciples to settle down in front of the tragic reality. Your strength is nothing. In front of the 3 major blockades, who do you think you are? Killing several birds with 1 stone. Where did he see this operation before? But just as he was drinking tea and sighing with emotion, he heard the voice of the Sword Saint. "By the way, this is Mr. Huai Shi on the left. I think everyone has already seen him." While chatting, the Sword Saint said casually, "From tomorrow onwards, he will be the deputy curator of the dojos. You have to respect and love him just like you respect and love me." What the hell? Huai Shi tried hard to restrain his expression and not show his trademark silly look. He looked at the Sword Saint in confusion. "What do you mean?" The Sword Saint also looked at him and smiled slightly, as if they already had a tacit understanding. But what kind of tacit understanding did they have? Today was just the first time they had met. Suddenly, Elder Luo's words to him before rang in his ears. You just have to sit, listen to the music, eat and drink well, and finally take the gift and leave. Maybe they will even send you directly to the door and welcome you to come again next time. So, you're just waiting for me here. I was drinking and eating at the side, but the word arrangement fell from the sky. How did I become a shareholder of the dojos before I even finished my meal? Please don't be a legal representative used as a scapegoat. In the end, before he could raise his objection, there was a disturbance below. It seemed that someone had angrily slammed the table and stood up to speak. Huaishir was instantly enraptured, and his eyes were filled with encouragement and anticipation. Hurry up and make a scene, big brother, make a big scene, and show this old thing what's good for him. In the end, Shang Quan casually glanced at the middle-aged man, who was unable to restrain his anger, like a mouse that had seen a cat. His face turned pale, and he fell to the ground, unable to speak. This made Huaishir extremely angry. Why is he such a useless piece of metal? At least say no. I have to do something. In the end, Shang Quan ignored the shocked expressions of the teachers and disciples below and continued. Also, this day Tengu on the right will also be the deputy head of the dojos from tomorrow onwards. You have to respect him, just like how you respect me. After all, the previous abrupt announcement, Tengu, this time, a veteran ascendant, the reaction from below famous seemed to be a little smaller. He was the ruler of Mount Tengu, and with such a noble status, it was not a disgrace to be the deputy head of the dojos. But in the past, the operation of the dojos had always been decided by the sword sage. Why did he suddenly bring in Danbua and Mount Tengu, one near and one far away, amidst this drastic change? Everyone smelled a sense of unease and absurdity. Could it be that the rumors circulating among the higher-ups were true? Just as everyone has thought, I'm already old, and my energy is lacking. Recently, I've also felt tired and weak, and I'm afraid I don't have the energy to manage the dojos. That energetic old man calmly announced, I have 3 sons and 1 daughter. In order to protect the previous High Emperor, my eldest son had died in hell. My youngest son unfortunately died young and did not reach adulthood. After my daughter got married, only my second son accompanied me. The moment he said that, the pale-faced dissenter was stunned for a moment. Then a look of ecstasy appeared on his face. Naoki, come out. Sword Sage said, come in front of me. Thus, the middle-aged man excitedly stood up and tried his best to squeeze out a solemn expression. He walked forward with steady steps and kneeled in front of the old man. Father, there's no need to say anything more between us father and son. The old man patted his shoulder with gratification. You have already grown up, Naoki. It's time for you to have your own achievements. He paused for a moment and said, from today onwards, you will replace me as the High Emperor's swordsmanship instructor and serving Zhou. Naoki smiled happily and was about to nod his head when he was stunned. He stood there in a daze. His eyes widened in disbelief. The silence was so sudden that everyone suspected that there was something wrong with their ears. They did not expect that the sword sage would so abruptly throw his only remaining successor away from the foundation of the dojo. It was true that being the High Emperor's swordsmanship instructor was an honor. However, other than a noble reputation, this position had nothing else. Could it be that the High Emperor really wanted to learn swordsmanship? Don't joke around. The High Emperor's current body could barely run a marathon. He might as well find a radio gymnastics teacher to train his body. The title of a swordsmanship instructor? What was the difference between that and a mascot? This was an order that was akin to banishment. What? You don't agree? Shang Chuan stared at his only remaining son. Naoki, are you going to disobey my order? This son doesn't dare. Naoki finally lowered his head and agreed in a daze. However, he could not help but cry. Only please allow me to stay and accompany my father to fulfill my filial piety for a period of time. You being able to listen to my orders is the best filial piety you can show your father. The dojo was not something that this son of his, who had great ambition but little talent, could meddle with. Only a ruthless banishment was the only way to preserve his life and the efforts of others. The more decisive and irreversible it was, the more he would be cherished. Obediently go and be a harmless mascot. This was the choice that the Sword Saint made as a father after seeing countless people die. Just like this, he quietly stared at his son's figure as he staggered away. In the end, he announced the final appointment. Starting from next month, the dojo's affairs will be managed by this old man's eldest son's daughter, who is also this old man's granddaughter, Shangchuan Yaoxiang. I ask everyone to take good care of her. This old man will guide her from the side, and not let her make a mistake. Saying this, the old man raised his eyes. Yaoxiang, come and greet the guests. From today onwards, you will take my place to entertain everyone. Yes, esteemed grandfather. Behind the curtain, the dignified and serious girl slowly walked out. Following the old man's lead, she knelt beside him, right in front of everyone. Only now did Huaishur finally react. This was the result that the sword sage had gone to great lengths to obtain tonight. Under the witness of all the members in various parties, the new and old dojo would be handed over. But why did it feel like he was making arrangements for his death? Chapter 8:21. Behind tonight's lesson, it represented a ceremony similar to washing one's hands in a golden basin. Through the transfer of authority and the use of assistants, the dojo's renewal was completed. From then on, the Sword Saint would retire from the Jianghu. No one would have thought that the old man would let go so quickly and decisively, catching everyone off guard. Everything had already been settled. The old man took down the sword on his waist. Immediately after, the kneeling Haruka Kamiizumi respectfully held up the sword with both hands and displayed it in front of everyone. Then, carefully and solemnly, she hung it on her waist. In front of all the higher-ups and disciples of the dojo, the handover of the inheritance was completed. Before the undercurrent began to surge, the ending had already been finalized. The dust had settled, and there was no room for anyone with ulterior motives to act. He had even quietly introduced a strong ally like Mount Tengu and an ally like Danbua, who was close at hand to assist his successor to get through the period of weakness. Perhaps this was the art of war that the samurai spoke of, moving like lightning, unpredictable like the dark. Tengu-yama was far away at the border. His strength was huge, but it was impossible for him to shake the foundation of the dojo. With a powerful ally like Daitengu, the dojo that lost the Sword Saint would be able to get through the awkward handover period in a stable manner. And Danbua, who was close at hand, was also in a state of full recovery. His potential was huge, but for the time being, he was unable to scheme against the dojo. He could be fully trusted and cooperate with him as an equal. With Daitengu and Huaishur, no matter how useless Haruka Kamiizumi was, she would be able to preserve the vitality of the dojo. As for whether there would be any friction between the two sides after the honeymoon period, that would be a matter of time. No matter how wise one was, it was impossible to think so far ahead. Beside the old Sword Saint, the young girl began to methodically announce the reorganization and simplification of the dojo. She would withdraw from the management of Yomi no Kuni and focus on the operation of the dojo itself and the teaching of the disciples. This was probably the instruction of the Sword Saint. The old man's meaning was very clear. After stripping the dojo of all political attributes, he only hoped that it would continue to exist as Kamiizumi's dojo. As for the other things, he didn't care. What he wanted to leave behind was only the inheritance. After losing the Sword Saint, the dojo would no longer be able to hold on to the enormous amount of power it held. It was better to retreat at this moment than to be eaten by a pack of wolves in the future. However, the more Huaishir listened, the more uncomfortable he felt, because all the arrangements were centered around one point. If the Sword Saint was lost, how could the dojo survive for long? He did not hesitate to give him such a big piece of cake, and even gave him the title of deputy curator of the training hall. In the future, all the warriors of Ingzhou would be his disciples in name. Huaishir couldn't help but wonder, is this old man entrusting me to him? Then he heard the sound of thunder. At that moment, everyone heard a loud boom. From the mountains behind the training hall, a shrill bolt of lightning shot out from the sky and fell to the ground, tearing apart the barrier in front of it. In an instant, it reached the core of the training hall. Everyone was stunned and couldn't help but look up. In front of the Sword Saint, who dared to act so rashly. However, Shang Xuan lowered his eyes as if he didn't hear anything. It was as if he was old and asleep. However, the corners of his mouth seemed to be an illusion as a smile curled up. Only Huaishir could feel it. He was no longer here. No, he was never here. He just went back to where he was. At that moment, in the exquisite courtyard, behind the open door, the old man who was leaning on the chair and admiring the moonlight raised his eyes, looking at the dancing smoke and dust in the courtyard and the big pit that tore apart all the quiet and beautiful scenery. A burly figure slowly emerged from it. He grinned at him. "Long time no see, Shang Xuan." Elder Luo said, "Are you done with your funeral? I'm here to fight with you." Fight? The Sword Saint was amused. He laughed so hard that saliva came out. From the corner of his mouth, he coughed violently. On the chair, the old man, who was so thin that only his bones were left, was overjoyed. His sunken eyes were full of ridicule. "That's great, that's great." The old man, who was paralyzed on the chair and couldn't even wipe his saliva without a nurse, laughed. "At such an old age, hearing that someone wants to fight with me is like hearing a beauty express her feelings to me when I was young. It makes me ambitious. Ha ha." He tilted his head. His dry and thin neck was like a straw pole, which could barely support his head. "Sorry, Luo Siwei, you're late." He said, "You're 50 years late. As early as 50 years ago, I should have died." This was the truth that was strictly sealed by the genealogy of Ingzhou. This was the true appearance of the Sword Saint who lived in seclusion. When he was young, he fought too many people with swords. He was brave and ruthless and left so many scars. When he was old and wanted to maintain his health, he began to retreat. Although he had the title of Sword Saint, he couldn't stop his decline and aging day by day. According to the best medical treatment in the Survival Institute, according to common sense, he should have died of old age as early as 50 years ago. His consciousness was scattered, his soul collapsed, the divine and his body that was out of control solidified again and sank into the deepest hell, ushering in the most complete death. "I know." Elder Luo nodded. He held his chin and asked calmly, "Isn't there still a breath left? It's not a big deal." He knew all too well that the Sword Saint was the most famous of the hundreds of supreme skills that he had mastered. Just like the lactic acid accumulation that he loved the most among all his supreme skills, it was a terrifying power that defied common sense. Whether it was called Sword of the Heart or Desire Beyond Heaven, it was just a title given by outsiders. Its essence was the terrifying will that resisted death for 50 years with his last breath. In the beginning, it was just a fierce means to kill with one blow. However, in the end, it actually extended to such an unbelievable extent. From believing in the death of the enemy to believing in his own survival, derived from the blade and accomplished by Shang Quan himself, It could be said that this supreme skill was the sword saint himself at this moment. As long as he still had the strength to lift the blade towards death, he would not be defeated. Supreme skill, sword saint. The sword saint was amused. His laughter was hoarse and sharp. A response came from his rotten throat. You're just a person who's struggling at death's door. You don't even dare to unsheath your sword for 50 years. What else can you say? It was such a mockery. When he raised his sword to face death, he no longer had the strength to face other enemies. The reason why he had braced himself, held his breath, and endured for 50 years despite being in such a sorry state was just to be a decoration, in order to protect this tiger skin of his. For his disciples, for his former teacher, and for the kindness of the royal family and his family. Under the threat and domineering of the barbarian general, he used his own existence to redeem some dignity for the High Emperor as a deterrent bomb. He tried his best to preserve some vitality for the Ingzhou family. Now, the enemy was gone. I won't be able to hold on for much longer. He did not have much time left. In order to deter the enemy, he had to force himself to believe that he could still live, because unless he could live, there would be no turning back. Once he left the mortal world, there would be earth-shattering chaos. But now he could finally die. When? Elder Luo asked. About half a year later. The sword saint thought for a while and replied, when everything is on the right track. When that time comes, I can die in peace. When he said this, a relieved expression appeared on his ugly and withered face. It was a peace that made his opponent jealous. I really envy you, Shang Quan. Elder Luo sighed. You can die without any burden after doing what you want to do. There's no difference between not having any burden and being full of guilt. It's just death. It's the end. Shang Quan looked at his long-lost opponent with pity. It's a pity for you, Luo Siwei. It's really a pity. If you were born 30 years earlier, when I met you, I would have had a carefree battle, right? If your injuries had healed 10 years earlier, I would still have the strength to respond to your invitation, right? What a pity. It's okay. Elder Luo reached out and took out the silk handkerchief that his daughter gave him. He gently wiped Shang Quan's saliva and snot. He was so gentle. You can do it now. He sat beside Shang Quan on the chair that was specially prepared for him. He leaned against it and adjusted his posture. He casually invited him. What kind of place do you like? Downtown? Ruins? Wasteland? Forget about the sea. I'm a little seasick. Shang Quan thought for a while and smacked his lips. He was daydreaming. In the mountains, there are few people. I won't be disturbed. There are also deer and birds in the wild. It's very cold in winter. Yes, it's snowing. The world is white. It's so cold that it makes people shiver. Shang Quan narrowed his eyes and chuckled softly. But after drinking wine and finding a woman, I'll be hot all over when I come back. I'll bare my arms and sing. I'm not afraid of the cold. Elder Luo rolled his eyes. Are you still thinking about women now? Old pervert. What about you? If it's me, I'll probably wake up early and eat breakfast made by my daughter. After doing a few sets of anaerobic exercises, I'll go out for a run. Elder Luo thought for a while and said, the air is comfortable and fresh. It's as if the whole world is breathing. It'll be even better if I can find a worthy opponent. There won't be any regrets in a perfect day. That's what this old man thinks too. Listening to Elder Luo's words, Shang Quan sighed softly. He had long been fascinated. They smiled and stared at the night sky in the courtyard as if they could see that scene. Just like that, in the barren mountains covered in snow and on the white land, separated by the falling snowflakes, the decadent samurai who lingered in Yoshihara and the wandering monk who broke his precepts met. They stared at each other. Countless snowflakes fell in front of their eyes and turned into the illusion of rain. Therefore, there was no need to say anything more. This was a gift from the heavens. It was rare to meet an opponent. They just needed to smile. With gratitude, they raised their fists, pulled out their swords, and gambled their lives to fight here. Until the winner was decided. Until they returned after having fun. At that moment, everyone in Yomio no Yomiasaka suddenly woke up and raised their heads. They saw an illusion that did not exist here. It was raining, but the sky was empty. Only some invisible things were falling down one after another. When they raised their hands to receive it, they could feel the illusory coldness. It was snow. When they closed their eyes, they could hear the sound of snow and wind from afar, bringing with it the roar of swords. There was also the sound of thunder. Drummer. Huaisher suddenly raised his head and stared at the ceiling above his head. He felt the sound of the sky. It was such a familiar rhythm that it had almost been engraved into his instincts. The sound echoed in the sky. It was as if 5 invisible fingers were clenching, turning the sky into an iron fist. The sound of thunder. Then, a high-pitched cry completely cut everything. The wind and snow disappeared without a trace. It was as if a towering mountain broke through the clouds and soared high in the sky. It was the ruler of all things. Huaisher could feel the profound and proud while reverberating in the sound of the cry. It made people feel an indescribable pressure. During the banquet, Hisakua was so excited that his hands trembled. This is Teacher's Sword of Heaven City. Right now, between the heaven and earth, in this excessively narrow border, there was a tremendous aura rising from the mountains. It was like a giant wrestling with strength, trampling on the earth and dancing in the sky, turning the mountains and stars into its own weapons. When it collided with each other, it set off a storm in the world. Huaisher closed his eyes and merged into the vast symphony. Chapter 8:22. For the whole night, Yomi and Yashizaka were immersed in the collision of wills. The sky and earth were spinning, and the sun and moon were dim. In the distant and unimaginable snowfield, the sky was already falling and the earth was cracking. Wild warriors and monks who had broken their vows. They laughed heartily and were immersed in blood and fighting. They prayed devoutly, grateful for each other's meeting and such a hearty battle. A clear fist mark appeared on the sword saint's skinny face, and on Elder Luo's body, sword marks crisscrossed like a net. Once and again, countless times, they closed their eyes and imagined the beauty of meeting each other, smiling, until the sun shone at dawn. The burly old man looked back at his opponent beside him. "Are you satisfied, Yomi?" The old man let out a sharp laugh and let him wipe the saliva from the corner of his mouth. His eyes were shining with a terrifying fire. It was so dazzling. "Can we do it again?" He said, "I want to do it again." "Forget it. I'm afraid I won't be able to hold back and really kill you." "Ha! You say it as if you can do it." The sword saint laughed. "I haven't lost yet. I haven't died yet. You're just being shameless. I won't play with you anymore." Elder Luo said in disdain. He could not bear the absurdity and anger rising in his heart. But it's meaningless. What else can you ask me for?" Elder Luo said. No matter how much she growth was the and joy only you person gain, he cared about, it will only increase the pain and sadness was of death. Was there anything else you should that learn to spare no effort? Then the last under time, the rising sun. The last time, the old man in the shadow stared at the student in and front stared of him at the rising dawn in the distance. This was the last time they played. Everything is irreversible. When the morning dew wet Huaisher's pants, please kill her. He saw Elder Luo walking out of the gap. Do I have to do it? As if he had returned from a night trip. Only you can kill her. He was satisfied. The old man said. His footsteps were light. Only you personally hummed a vague song. A child of the abyss who was leaning against the corner of the wall than before. "Are you leaving? You have the responsibility to kill her." His footsteps paused for a moment. Everything is not irreversible. He looked over. Huaisher said, also even in the end, his expression was speak of.
the old man said.
Time waits for no one.
You have seen the end,
Elder Luo said.
Since the end
Before
of the
death
rookie
comes,
competition,
we all have things
what
to do.
remains is no
We can't
longer a
rest
state that you
yet,
and I can
be it me
understand,
or you.
the so-called
Where are we
solidification,
going?
the
Huaisha
so-called
asked.
sublimation.
The old man
They
said,
were originally
to finish
one
the
body.
unfinished business
They were
of the
all
past.
rebellions that
He
broke
took a deep
away
look
from the Silver
at
Ocean.
Huaisha.
If the existence of the
If
Silver
you feel
Ocean
sorry
was regarded as
and
a
want to
whole of
repay
humanity,
me, I
then
only have
the
one thing for
sublimers
you.
and the
Huaisha did not
solidifiers were
answer.
unforgivable
Elder Luo
heresies.
didn't say anything else.
Regardless of whether
He
it was
waited for
beneficial
him
to the
until he
present
shook his
world
head.
or not.
I
These
don't want
two
these
were
things.
violations of the
The
three
old man
major
smiled.
seals and
Then
were
do you
hidden
want money?
dangers that
I still
threatened
have
the
money
existence
here.
of the Silver Ocean.
This is not
Even if
something
it was
that can be
beneficial to the
exchanged.
present world because
Huaisha said,
it could
"You
increase
taught
the
me,
correction
drummer,
value
use steps,
and could be allowed to
ultrastate.
exist.
And now
the
you are
Astronomy
teaching me
Association
these.
had always been
Mastery
stubbornly
state.
holding on
Help
to
me
more
gain
than
a
100
foothold in
sublimation
incontinent
quotas.
every
Help me
year
increase
and
great
refuse
sea
to
Ming's
mass-produce
divinity.
sublimers.
I really
It was
appreciate
also
it,
to maintain
but I can't
the
do it.
stability of the Silver
I haven't
Ocean.
even said
Actively
anything
extracting
yet.
a soul from the
Huaisha was
Silver Ocean
amused.
through technology and means, no matter how cautious they were, would cause damage to the Silver Ocean. Even if it was a wild sublimer like Huaisha who broke free from the main body through various accidents, even if the consequences were smaller, it was not worth encouraging and advocating. At the same time, during this process, the sublimation of consciousness into a soul would inevitably bring about impact and change. Perhaps most of these changes were positive, but change was change. It was impossible to ignore it just because it was good. Solidification was also a change. Just like the water vapor that sublimated from the sea froze into frost, this change was far more violent and thorough than sublimation. It could even completely change a person's consciousness and thoughts. Under the influence of temperature, it was infinitely closer to the abyss. It was a drastic change that could turn the world upside down. The new self would kill the old self. The monster killed the human. No, it would be better to say that the solidified soul created by the abyss used the old consciousness as a hotbed and nourishment. After swallowing everything, it was born with a new appearance. At that time, the solidifier would no longer be the original sublimer, but just a container that contained the essence of hell. Just existence, and the present world would cause distortion. Just breathing would cause damage to the world. It was like an irreversible cancer. It had nothing to do with morality or interests. This was a hostile relationship that existed in this world before humans were born with consciousness. It could not be avoided or alleviated with any other good reason. Once Luo Xian became to that extent, Huaisha could never be compatible with her. She was originally heading towards solidification, the old man said, but she was changed by you. Huaisha said, angrily, but all I did was play some insignificant tricks. A little bit of love won't change anything. Why don't you want to believe that she chose to stay? I believe. The old man nodded, so solemn and serious. That's why I'm so grateful to you. Why, sure, you gave her a reason to stay. But all of this is not based on her will. He asked, what state do you think she is in now? Is it sublimation or solidification? Or hovering around the melting point? The answer was both at the same time. The innate essence of the abyss and the soul that was born as a human were contained in the same body. Even with the mediation of the celestial genealogies, stigmata, it could not be guaranteed. From the day she was born, part of her had already entered a solidified state. It was like stepping on the edge of a cliff. Part of it was in hell, and part of it was in the human world. Now, she had already left the edge of the cliff, but she did not return to the ground. Instead, she came to the top of the abyss, stepping on a thin line, moving forward alone. No one knew when this thin line would break, nor did they know what was waiting on the other side of the line. She was well aware of this, so she chose to escape, to exile herself, and to seek answers. But there would be no answers. Exile would not lead to any results. One day, she would travel the entire world. At that time, she would find that she could not find any answers. At that time, everything will come to an end, the old man said. If the end is the worst one, Huaishur interrupted him. I won't do that. Of course I know. The old man nodded matter-of-factly. That's why I'm telling you. Otherwise, why don't I look for Xian Niao? Fu Cangguang? White Emperor's son. Even if it's a weapon grandmaster, I can find some connections. Why would I come to you? Huaishur? Huaishur was stunned. He saw the mocking smile on Elder Luo's face. What do you mean? It's simple, Huaishur. As long as I tell you, you'll feel an inexplicable sense of responsibility. You won't ignore it, and you'll do it again and again. I don't believe in promises and promises, but I only have expectations for your ignorant nature. He raised his hand and patted the young man's shoulder. I believe in you. The world might change drastically tomorrow, but you can always believe in Huaishur, the tool of the world. What kind of F**king logic is this? Huaishur could not help but feel that it was ridiculous. Look on the bright side. Maybe there will be a solution tomorrow, right? The old man put his hands in the pockets of his tight shorts. Like any old man going out for a morning exercise, he walked away unsteadily. Wait, where are you going? Huaishur turned around and asked. The old man waved his hand without looking back. Tell him, I'm going to hell. Kavanasi, India. A scorching wind blew from afar. The traveling girl looked up at the tragic scenery below the ridge. She could not help but sigh. It's just like hell. Beside him, a stooped Indian was holding a walking stick. He wiped the cold sweat on his forehead. If you go any further, you'll be out of our range, Madame Luo. It's okay. It's good enough that you can send me this far. Luo Xian moved her body and listened to the creaking sound from her neck. I'll walk on my own from now on. Please be careful. The guide swallowed and looked down at the hell on earth below. People who could come here probably did not care about safety, right? The Kavanasi temple, which was once the most prosperous holy land of destruction in India, had now sunk into the darkness behind the light of isolation. Through the faint light curtain, one could see the wriggling, ferocious objects in the darkness and the burning blood on the dim light. 50 years ago, 1/3 of the Indian lineage was pushed to the brink of destruction overnight. Even after so many years, it was still difficult to recover. The culprit who caused all this, the element of destruction that caused the Kavanasi temple to fall into hell, the Pied Piper, had long disappeared into the darkness. To be honest, I'm curious. The guide mustered up his courage and said, the interior of Kavanasi is already a real hell. Although it is offensive to God Shiva, it is already a place where evil is entrenched. One day, the Tianwen Association will ignore the objections of the lineage and sink this place into hell. Over the years, it's not that no one wanted to enter it, but they were all desperate desperados or simply explorers who had no way out and wanted to make a comeback. Very few people returned. But why did someone like you choose to come here? Do I look different from those people? Luo Xian laughed. To be honest, I'm more afraid of you, the guide said bitterly. The guide replied bitterly. Even though the young girl in front of him had never done anything violent or bloody, he could instinctively sense the malevolence and darkness that made him shudder. She had never tried to hide her feelings. To be honest, it's just on the way. Luo Xian thought for a moment and said seriously, but I thought that since I'm passing by, I might as well go to the place where my father studied. It's also a kind of spiritual baptism. She paused and stared at the hell in front of her. She whispered softly, besides, I'm also very curious. What does my mother's hometown look like? Chapter 8:23. He felt as if he was in hell. On the operating table, Yu Dongri listened to the sounds of the instruments colliding with each other. He could not help but imagine that he was an innocent victim lying on the experimental table of a mysterious organization. Soon, a bunch of biochemical organs and viruses would be stuffed into his body, turning him into a messy monster. Then, a chip would be inserted into his brain, and he would become a random soldier that the main character in a fantasy story would kill after breaking into the enemy's base. While his body was being torn apart and cut apart, he still seemed to be distracted. His mind was filled with messy plots. He was laughing at himself. Then, the chief surgeon raised his head and looked at him. The eyes behind the mask were serious. Name, why sure? He subconsciously hesitated for a moment before replying. Then, he saw the chief surgeon's expression become serious. His self-awareness is in disorder. The operation will be suspended. Hurry up and arrange for a CT scan of his brain. Maintain the source. No, I'm just kidding. He practically dragged the hole in his stomach and jumped up from the operating table. I'm Yu Dongri. Yu Dongri, okay. Mr. Liu, you better not have a sense of humor when you're so serious. The chief surgeon picked up the oxygen mask and stuffed it over his face. He turned around and ordered the anesthesiologist, add 50 grams of Forsyth for get worries. Use the B4 concentrated version. Yes. Soon, a faint purple gas flowed into his mouth and nose. Like ice water, it extinguished the messy thoughts in his mind and suppressed his emotions. Only cold, mechanical thoughts were left. Everything is normal. The operation will continue, just like that. He raised the chainsaw and cut open the layers of steel that covered Yu Dongri's heart. Sparks flew everywhere. An ear-piercing sound rang out. The box that imprisoned the demon was gradually opened. The seals that Huaishur had placed on Yu Dongri's body were removed layer by layer. Outside the operating room, behind the floor-to-ceiling glass, Perron stood quietly with an expressionless face. He clenched his fists tightly behind him. His iron fingertips rubbed against each other, creating sparks. Uneasiness. Don't be nervous. A voice came from the shadow beside him. For this kind of thing, it's easy to do it the first time, but it's easy to do it the third time or the fourth time. Steady, steady. In the silence, Perron turned around indifferently and looked beside him. The woman drinking milk tea, the shadow under her feet, and the huge bird spreading its wings in the dark. Tangi, what's the matter? If you really want to comfort me, I only have one request. Okay, go ahead. It's okay to change the lines you like. Just don't talk. I beg you, said Perron. My loving father is really scary when he's angry. Tangi stared at the faint lightning in his eyes. She smiled but didn't say anything, because there was a clear cracking sound. The last shackle was broken. There was no heart behind the iron shell. Instead, there was only darkness and nothingness. It was like a crack leading to hell, surging with tides. At that moment, Yu Dongri's eyes fell into a daze and calmness. In the darkness, a pair of scarlet eyes slowly looked up. The eyes were like a gorgeous wheel, with countless needles spinning rapidly. A shrill sound burst out. The moment the chainsaw was raised, a sharp needle of darkness condensed into the shape of a needle and flew out from the crack in the heart. The chief surgeon's movements didn't change at all. He put down the chainsaw indifferently and picked up the instrument in his hand again, because there was lightning bursting out of nowhere. As Perron lifted his finger, the ruler embryo's power was instantly crushed. But right after that, even more sharp needles flew out from within. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds, for seconds, the appearance of each needle gave people an unrealistic feeling of trance, as if time was rapidly passing, but immediately after, it was shattered by endless thunderbolts from the void. There were some needles that slipped through the chief surgeon's body, but the chief surgeon held the instrument expressionlessly and stabbed into the darkness. His hands didn't tremble at all. An ear-piercing sound burst out. In the countless cracks, the mosquitoes stopped moving and died in an instant. But in this desolate border, except for Perron, the chief surgeon's team, and Yu Dongri, there was no other living thing. Tangi calmly drank her milk tea and let the needles that grew out of nowhere penetrate her body. Then the needles disappeared like phantoms, as if they had never existed, and from that moment onwards, the solidification began. The crack in the heart spread rapidly, but it was blocked by the instrument in the chief surgeon's hand. Two fist-sized semicircular, complex instruments closed in the hole in the heart. After combining the technology of the Continuation Academy, a new law was born and instantly sealed the ruler embryo inside. In the darkness, countless needles spun wildly. A huge and solemn figure suddenly jumped from the other side of time. The ruler who had yet to be born wailed to his future self and called for help. Then, the ruler in his prime descended from the sky. Then, he saw the man in front of him, his bald head, and his iron fist. King Hebe raised his eyes. An array of blazing lightning shot out from the corner of his eyes. The golden hand had already grasped his neck and slowly pulled him up from the ground. The terrifying power that was second only to the natural enemy had descended here and suppressed the monster's performance. This was the border, the edge of the 3 blockades. It was not in hell where he ran rampant. Is this all you can do, Dongli? Perron stared indifferently at the thing that was no longer his son. It seems that even if you start to do bad things, this is all you can do. It was really not like him. At that moment, the resonance of time was crushed by the iron fist. His body fell apart. From within, countless reeds, needles, complicated gears, complicated pendulums, and even needles inlaid with emeralds and jade fell from the cracks and quickly disappeared. The solidified person raised his broken head and wailed loudly, calling for his other self. He wanted to repeat the same trick, but it was too late. The huge alchemy array was activated at that moment, covering the ceiling, the floor, the 4 walls, and everything. Then it disappeared into Yu Dongri's body. From that moment onwards, the distant past had been covered. The future no longer existed. The huge body stiffened in an instant, froze, turned into darkness, and dissipated. Only the ticking of the second hand echoed silently in his ears, hovering around Yu Dongri. It gathered in the crack in his chest. The operation continued, and from within, countless gears and reeds appeared, and then formed a complicated escapement mechanism. Countless machines were constantly changing, deducing countless classic clock structures. In the end, when the low heartbeat began to move together with the balance wheel and hairspring, a disc condensed on the surface of the heart. 3 sharp needles unfolded, and with the beating of the heart, they moved towards the future. Click! There was a soft sound. Yu Dongri opened his eyes and saw the future that was no longer far in front of him. He suddenly raised his hand and grabbed the chief surgeon in front of him. The moment his fingers closed, a sharp glass clip appeared between his fingers, and he held it tightly. It was almost close to the chief surgeon's pupils, causing his compupils to contract in an instant. "Are you okay?" He looked at the stunned doctor and showed concern for him out of the blue. The chief surgeon frowned and was about to speak when he heard a loud shattering sound. The floor-to-ceiling glass that had cracked during the struggle finally could not bear the weight and fell apart. Countless shards flew, but the place where the two of them were was not affected at all. The only fatal hidden danger had long been removed in the past, dead silence. The doctor was stunned on the spot, and Yu Dongri looked at him, waiting for his answer. He swallowed. I'm okay. The operation was a success. What am I? A substitute? A damn pawa? After wearing countless observation devices, Yu Dongri stood in front of the shooting range and tried to move his body, but he found that there was almost no difference from before. There was no increase in strength, and he continued to be so weak that it made people cry. After taking 2 steps, he was panting. At most, he just said goodbye to the wheelchair. However, behind him, there was a pitch-black projection that moved according to his movements. It followed his changes and formed a ferocious humanoid creation with sharp edges and corners. It was like a demon created from the crystallization of hell, and it looked exactly the same as the ruler who had never been born and died in the womb. However, it had lost its terrifying corrosive nature and turned into another body that could freely switch between source substance and matter. Between the two, there was a thin rope that connected and sank into Yu Dongri's heart. When he received the notification that the test had begun, he lowered his head, picked up the pistol on the table, and aimed at the target in front of him. After thinking for a moment, he pulled the trigger repeatedly, but there was no sound of gunfire. When the needle on the exposed mechanical dial in front of his heart suddenly moved forward for a second, the target exploded into a pile of fragments. No trajectory could be captured, and no traces of gunfire could be found. Even the examination of the muzzle and hands couldn't find any traces of gunpowder. The order of time was disrupted. When the trigger was pulled, the bullet flew out, and during the process of hitting the target, the part where the bullet flew out was removed, and the only thing left was the terrifying result of pulling the trigger and hitting the target. But when he put down the pistol, there were continuous gunshots and sparks bursting out from where the muzzle was originally. A pile of bullet casings appeared on the ground out of thin air. They bounced, glowing with a red copper light. The experiment continued, and in the follow-up test, the 6 machine guns aimed at him continuously fired until the barrels melted, but they didn't hurt him at all. Only the wall behind him was full of holes. He casually strolled in the rain of bullets. The needle on the dial in front of his chest jumped back and forth without any pattern, constantly fiddling with the time axis of the objects, throwing the process of hitting him to after he left the place. With his own strength, he actually reached a level comparable to Kronos. It's just like a miracle. In the observation room, the ecstatic experimenter opened his eyes wide in excitement and looked back at Perron behind him. We can actually use the soul of a human to control the authority of a ruler. We have achieved an unprecedented result. It's not unprecedented, Perron said faintly. Similar experiments have already been done in the Preservation Institute's laboratory 70 to 80 years ago. This is just a sealed technology. After stripping away the key data and technology obtained from countless bloody sacrifices, its principle was simple. What it used was incomplete solidification. By artificially dividing a person's soul into 2 parts and forcibly solidifying one part, one could obtain an acquired and controlled solidifier. However, no one had been able to reach the terrifying depth of Yu Dongri, and the Continuation Institute didn't have the luxury of using people with resonant physiques as experimental subjects. Using the pollution that Huaishur couldn't eradicate, the process of transforming into the abyss was restarted, and the range was limited to Yu Dongri's heart. Through the dusty technology of the Continuation Institute, under heavy blockades, the solidification was now within the controllable range. At that time, the solidified part of the soul couldn't cover the entire soul outside and could only turn inwards and complete itself in this narrow range. Even if it was the weakest and most basic structure. Like a weak premature baby, it was congenitally deficient and difficult to grow. Then, Perron, the ascendant who was second only to the 7 natural enemies in the entire realm, completely crushed the ruler's consciousness, smoothed it out, and controlled it with other technology. In the end, with the umbilical cord that couldn't be cut short as the hub, Yu Dongri's soul controlled his solidified body, achieving a different kind of control. This time I'm a mother. Yu Dongri's excited shout came from afar. The corner of Perron's eyes twitched, and he couldn't help but want to clench his iron fist of domestic violence. But after holding it in for a long time, he finally turned around and pushed the door open. He saw the woman humming a song and playing with her phone in the corridor. "Are you done?" Tanguy looked up and asked, "I'll say this first. I don't provide after-sales service. If there are any problems in the future, I won't be responsible." "Green Day can solve it," Perron said. "Anyway, thank you for the technology you provided. Don't worry about it." Tanguy smiled happily and sighed meaningfully. "I'm just thinking about my silly child." In the long silence, Perron was stunned for a long time. After a long time, he sighed softly. "You really have become powerful." Have I?" Tanguy said seriously. "A big sister like me is always the embodiment of virtue that conforms to the times." Perron didn't want to talk to her anymore. In just 2 days, he was angry that he hadn't been in the past few decades. He was physically and mentally exhausted. After quitting smoking for so long, this was the first time he needed the comfort of nicotine. He shook his head and asked directly, "What I'm more curious about is you actually came out. It's strange. You can betray me, so why can't I come out?" Tanguy asked back, "I can't stay in a ruined library for the rest of my life, right? If that's the case, Russell's movements during this period of time can be explained." He pinched his chin and pondered for a moment. His expression gradually became ugly. "Wait, do you want to rebuild the utopia?" Tanguy's expression didn't change. "Why not?" "Give up,"
Perron said
it's no
indifferently.
longer realistic.
"Once the utopia
Perron
is
said
rebuilt,
indifferently,
the entire reality will probably be affected. Source substance, spirit essence, and transformation. The 3 major axes. These were the 3 pillars that supported the reality. The silver sea projected by the source substance pillar, the heaven formed by the spirit essence pillar, and the 3 major seals supported by the transformation pillar. If the utopia was to be rebuilt, then it was imperative to rebuild the heaven. But the current reality could no longer support such a huge change, and after being absent for such a long time, this world could no longer make room for a behemoth like the utopia. "The Command Bureau won't let you do as you please," Perron warned seriously. "I'm not interested either. Look at what you're saying. I'm not here to talk to you about this." Tanguy widened her eyes and said seriously, "I'm here to ask you for advice." "You? Advice? Me?" Perron suspected that there was something wrong with his ears. "Yes." Tanguy came closer and held his hand. With a serious expression, she asked, "You've been a godfather for so many years and taught so many children. You must be very experienced. For example, if a child reaches puberty and often ignores you or even despises you, how should you make him respect you like he did in the past?" She thought for a moment and added, "It's best to make him rely on you, the kind that can't leave you." In the long silence, Perron was silent for a very, very long time. His indifferent expression gradually shattered, and what emerged was an indescribable shock and disgust. "Tanguy, people can't. At least they shouldn't, that you're tuning in to the Mystic Fist YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.